Chapter 71. Chichi, I feel like I've been blessed by God recently. The company's performance is improving day by day. Pei Ming's expression was one of extreme satisfaction. I can't believe that a flower has bloomed in my old age. Zhu Meilin sat far away and said sourly, it's all because of Jinrong's family. Otherwise, do you really think you can make a comeback? Pei Ming smiled awkwardly. Part of it. Dad is the best in my heart. Pei Chichi said softly, greatly comforting Pei Ming. He smiled with infinite satisfaction. Zhu Meilin heard it. Just comfort yourself. How can you say such rude words in front of a child? Pei Ming couldn't help but scold her. Zhu Meilin was usually arrogant, but was it appropriate to say such words in front of a child? Zhu Meilin smiled strangely. Chichi is not a child anymore. Pei Chichi understood what she meant, so she smiled. Yes, Dad. Pei Huan and I have grown up. Zhu Meilin's nose was crooked. This bitch had a sharp tongue. She didn't try to show off anymore. She and Pei Huan now understood that Tang Yu was now Pei Chichi's backer. There was no benefit in offending her. However, she wanted to see how long this flower, Pei Chichi, could bloom on Tang Yu's bedside. Pei Chichi didn't stay for dinner, even though Pei Ming wanted her to. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Pei Chichi didn't immediately return to Xia City after leaving. Instead, she went to the city library to borrow 2 books. When she came out, the heat wave brought by the bright sun rushed in. Her whole body seemed to be washed by the heat. Pei Chichi held a small bag to block the sun as she slowly walked to the bus stop. A black limousine slowly stopped beside her. Pei Chichi took a step back. The window rolled down. An extremely beautiful lady was sitting in the driver's seat. She wore a pair of Chanel sunglasses on her exquisite nose. Her beautiful red lips opened slightly. Miss Pei, I am Tang Yu's mother. I want to talk to you. Pei Chichi looked at her, but she couldn't see into her eyes. The woman in the car said that she was Tang Yu's mother and that she had met Lin Yun before. I'm sorry, I don't know you. Pei Chichi took another step back and walked toward the bus stop. In the car, Zhao took off her sunglasses. Wait a minute. Pei Chichi subconsciously turned around and was stunned. That woman was very similar to her. She had seen the photos that Pei Ming had secretly hidden. They were exactly the same. The blood in her body seemed to be surging, but it also seemed to be completely frozen. She couldn't move her body at all. Zhao Ke's voice softened a little, not as arrogant as before. Get in the car. This is not the place to talk. Pei Chichi pursed her lips into a straight line, and there was no color on her lips. After a long time, she finally opened the back door of the car and sat inside. Zhao Ke put on her sunglasses and turned the car around. 10 minutes later, Zhao Ke brought Pei Chichi to a very secluded coffee shop, the kind with a small private room. Pei Chichi sat opposite Zhao Ke. She stared at Zhao Ke in front of her. Zhao Ke looked very elegant. Her Chanel suit made her look even more beautiful. Her face was exquisitely made up, and her hair was tied up. She looked like a rich lady. 2 cups of mo tai, Zhao Ke said softly to the waiter, then looked at Pei Chichi. You're not picky, right? Pei Chichi shook her head slowly. In fact, she didn't drink coffee. Chapter 72. Zhao Ke looked at Pei Chichi, and Pei Chichi noticed that Zhao Ke didn't want to look at her. She just glanced at her for a moment, and then immediately lowered her head to stir the coffee in the cup. Zhao Ke picked up the cup gracefully and took a sip. She looked up and saw that Pei Chichi didn't move. She smiled faintly and said, These are coffee beans imported from Holland. You can't get them in a regular coffee shop. Pei Chichi pushed the cup forward and looked straight at Zhao Ke. I don't like coffee. So, no matter how good the coffee beans were, they were not attractive. Zhao Ke's eyes showed a hint of displeasure, but she hid it well. She put down the cup, wiped her lower lip with a tissue, and took out her lipstick to touch up her makeup. Then she said unhurriedly, Tell me, how much do you want? Pei Chichi looked at her, her eyes a little hot. This woman, who looked very similar to her, appeared in front of her not to look at her, but to ask her to leave Tang Yu. Pei Chichi's little face was expressionless as she stared into Zhao Ke's eyes. Slowly, she said, You married Tang Yu's father, right? There was a trace of anger in Zhao Ke's eyes, as well as a trace of discomfiture, as if she had been seen through. No matter what, I'm Tang Yu's mother now. I don't want you to pester him. Tell me, how much do you want to leave him? Zhao Ke said as she took out a slender cigarette from her handbag, lit it, and took a puff. Even the way she smoked was very beautiful. She used to be the most beautiful woman in B City. Pei Chichi couldn't remember how long it had been since she last blinked. Her whole body was a little numb. 1 billion, and I'll leave him. Mrs. Tang, is that okay? Pei Chichi's voice was very soft, but in Zhao Ke's ears, it was extremely sarcastic. 1 billion. Even after she married Tang Jiyuan and suffered for so many years, Tang Jiyuan still didn't give her 1 billion. She stubbed out the cigarette in annoyance and looked at Pei Chichi. That's too much. 10 million. If you agree, I'll write you a check immediately. Pei Chichi didn't move. She looked into Zhao Ke's eyes and asked, Are you my mother? Zhao Ke had already stretched out her hand to take the check, but after hearing what Pei Chichi said, she froze. She slowly raised her eyes and looked at Pei Chichi as if she had seen a ghost. She wanted to take out another cigarette, but found that the pack was empty. Suddenly, she said in a shrill voice, I'm not your mother. I don't know you. I never knew you. With trembling hands, Zhao Ke grabbed the bag on the table and almost stumbled out. The sound of high heels hammered into Pei Chichi's heart. It was very painful, like a nail being hammered into his heart. The chair that she had been sitting on was slanted across the room. Zhao Ke accidentally dropped a paper bag on the table. Pei Chichi picked it up and a name card fell out. It was a director of a club, and the name on it was Zhao Ke. Zhao Ke. Pei Chichi repeated the name over and over again. Pei Ming always told her that her mother loved her very much and that her mother passed away after giving birth to her, but now she saw that her mother's name was Zhao Ke. She was Tang Yu's stepmother. She married someone else and had a man other than Pei Ming. She didn't love her at all. She didn't even dare to look at her. Chapter 73. Pei Chichi thought that she would not care about the word mother in this life, but when Zhao Ke appeared in front of her, she still could not control herself. It turned out that she also longed for love. But now, her heart felt as if it had been drenched by a heavy downpour. He was thoroughly and thoroughly dead. She did not know how long she had been sitting there. The waiter came twice, but when he saw her like this, he secretly left. It was not until the sky turned dark that Pei Chichi walked out shakily. In the sky, there was a light drizzle. Under the streetlights, the raindrops were as dense as fine needles. She raised her head and looked at the sky, letting the light rain fall on her face. She walked aimlessly, ignoring the abrasion on her feet. Blood seeped out along with the rainwater, leaving streaks of dark red blood. The rain became heavier and heavier, like beans falling from the sky. The sky was completely grey, and even the lights at night could not illuminate it. Finally, she squatted down and hugged her knees with her arms, her body shivering. Ju Meilin's words kept replaying in her mind. Pei Chichi, you are the same as that bitch mother of yours. Pei Chichi smiled absent-mindedly. It would be great if they were the same, then she would not be in pain. It turned out that the woman who gave birth to her had never loved her. Now, she came to look for her because she was afraid that she would destroy her happiness. Pei Chichi's whole body was ice cold. She hugged herself tightly, but she could not feel any warmth. She heard her phone ringing non-stop, but she did not want to pick it up. After a long time, the phone went silent. Her face was on her knees, and her eyes were open. Her clothes had long been soaked by the rain. A black sports car came to a screeching halt beside her, and the person in the car opened the door and jumped out. He did not hold an umbrella, and walked quickly towards her. Tang Yu stretched out his hand to lift Pei Chichi's little face, and saw that there was not a single trace of blood on her pale little face. He stretched out his hand and patted her cheek. Pei Chichi, she did not respond, so he patted her twice hard, with enough force to turn her face black. This time, she woke up. Her face was wet, and so were her trembling eyelashes. She looked at him, her lips trembling, and for a long time she could not speak. Tang Yu's eyes darkened. He carried her to the back seat of the car, turned on the heater, and quickly took off her clothes, all of them. He sat down and placed Pei Chichi's body in his arms. He pulled a towel and carefully dried her body. When he did all of this, Pei Chichi did not resist. It was as if she had lost consciousness, allowing him to do all of this, but her eyes were empty. Tang Yu didn't ask. He reached out and began to unbutton his shirt, one button at a time. After taking it off, he put it on her and buttoned it up. His voice was a little hoarse. "I'll take you to the hospital." Damn it. Her body was very cold just now, but now it was abnormally hot. The person in his arms struggled violently, but in the end, she had no strength and went limp in his arms. Pei Chichi's eyes finally met his, and her voice was hoarse. "I don't want." Tang Yu stared at her for 2 seconds, and then he reached for his phone and dialed Meng Qingqing's number. "Call the director of Shengyuan Hospital to Xia City immediately." Chapter 74. Meng Qingqing immediately contacted the unlucky dean. When the dean heard that it was Tang Yu, he scrambled to Xia City. Tang Yu took the blanket and covered Pei Chichi with it. He patted her little head and stepped into the driver's seat. At this moment, his upper body was bare. Pei Chichi was wearing his shirt, wrapped in the blanket, and curled up in the back seat. After what felt like a century, he parked the car steadily in front of the apartment in Xia City. He carried her upstairs carefully and went straight to the bathroom. He filled the bathtub with warm water. Pei Chichi seemed to have realized something. She wanted to break free, but he hugged her tightly. His voice was hoarse and stern. "Listen to me." Pei Chichi quietened down. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Tang Yu peeled off the blanket on her and threw it aside. Then, he moved on to the shirt. When his fingers landed on the button, Pei Chichi's body trembled uncontrollably. Her voice was broken. I'll do it myself." However, he seemed to be angry. He firmly pulled on her button and hugged her back with one hand. Her back was boiling hot. Tang Yu's expression became more and more unpleasant. He held her with one hand and unbuckled his belt with the other. He sat in the warm water and helped her to sit in his arms. Soaking in the warm water was very comfortable. Pei Chichi was uneasy at first, but she gradually calmed down and lay quietly in his arms. She was like a homeless little animal. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her. He swallowed the questions he wanted to ask. She lay very quietly in his arms. She didn't say a word. Her little fingers were on his shoulder. Her face was tilted in his arms. Her breath was right on his sensitive spot. Tang Yu's body couldn't help but throb. His big palm pressed on her waist, however, that was all he could do. Anything more was impossible. At this moment, the doorbell rang. Pei Chichi looked up and stared at him with her misty eyes. Tang Yu did not have time to put away the love jade in his eyes. He felt a little uncomfortable and coughed lightly. "Time to put on your clothes." He carefully picked her up and put on their bathrobes before opening the door. The director of a certain hospital trembled as he walked in and wiped the rain off his face. "Mr. Tang, where are you feeling unwell?" "Inside." Tang Yu's tone was indifferent. He let them in and walked into the master bedroom. The dean also followed him in and carefully changed his shoes. Pei Chichi was lying on her side with her eyes closed. Her whole body was buried in the pure white blanket, revealing only half of her face. The dean was stunned by Pei Chichi's beauty. She might have a fever after being drenched in the rain. Tang Yu's gaze landed on President He. President He did not dare to look at her anymore. "Let's take her temperature first." Tang Yu was the one who took her temperature. However, the result still surprised him. At this moment, Pei Chichi's temperature was 39 degrees Celsius. "Give her a shot to reduce the fever first. Take the medicine and see if it can go down by tonight. If it doesn't work, we can only get an intravenous drip tomorrow." President He suggested. Tang Yu did not say anything. President He took out a shot to reduce the fever from his medicine box. Tang Yu sat by the bed and rolled up one side of Pei Chichi's sleeve. Her fair arm was exposed, and President He could not bear to do it. At this moment, Pei Chichi opened her eyes and saw the needle. It was thin and sharp. Chapter 75. Tang Yu was stunned for a moment before he realized that she was afraid of injections. And director, he was still holding a syringe in his hand. At that moment, he felt like a butcher, and that unbelievably beautiful young lady was a kind little rabbit. He didn't know what to do and could only raise the syringe in his hand awkwardly. Tang Yu was a little helpless. He hugged Pei Chichi and coaxed her in a low voice, "You'll get better after an injection." "I don't want an injection," she said incoherently as her little head burrowed into his chest again. Her long hair slipped into his open collar and tickled him. Tang Yu really didn't know that Pei Chichi was so afraid of pain. He patted her back and said in a gentler voice, "Be good, it won't hurt." He didn't see her like this the last time. Maybe she was more vulnerable when she was sick. She didn't say anything else. He reached out to push her messy hair aside and looked at her with her eyes closed. She looked like she was in pain. Or like she was asleep. Tang Yu hugged her carefully and signaled to Director He with his eyes. Director His forehead was sweating. He carefully bent over and gently pricked Pei Chichi's arm. He swore that he was really careful and gentle, but Pei Chichi woke up from the pain and moved a little. Director His voice was softer than the needle. "Don't move." He looked at Pei Chichi's moving little face and wanted to call her sweetheart. But if he did that, he probably wouldn't be able to be the director anymore. Pei Chichi didn't move, but she buried her little face in Tang Yu's arms and cried. At that moment, Tang Yu's heart was unbelievably soft. It was as if he would be Pei Chichi's pillar of support for the rest of her life. Director He retracted his supernatural powers and let out a long breath. "Mr. Tang, please feed me the medicine later. Once every 8 hours. You'll be fine if the temperature drops. If it still doesn't drop by tomorrow morning, you have to go to the hospital for an injection." He was still worried and reminded him again. Tang Yu nodded. Dean he left on his own, not daring to let anyone send him off. There was still a sweetheart waiting to be coaxed. After he left, Tang Yu's fingers gently stroked the little person in his arms and gently patted her back. After a while, he found that she seemed to have fallen asleep again. "Chichi," he called her in a low voice. Pei Chichi grunted and hugged his waist with her small hands. She snorted. "Daddy." Tang Yu was stunned. She called him Daddy. "Daddy, Chichi is in so much pain." Pei Chichi raised her little face and buried it in his neck. Tang Yu was almost scalded. He thought that she must have mistaken him for Pei Ming. For some reason, he reached out and patted her, trying to cheer her up. "Daddy's here. Be good, I'll go get the medicine." She hugged him tightly and refused to let go. Tang Yu had no choice but to kiss her forehead. "Be good, baby." Her little mouth was pressed against his neck, and her voice was a little hoarse and soft. "Daddy, can you call me baby again?" In front of Ju Mylin, Pei Ming didn't dare to spoil her like this. But now she was so uncomfortable. She wanted her daddy to hug her and call her baby. An indescribable wave surged in Tang Yu's heart. That wave was about to drown him. Chapter 76. He called out to her. After some thought, he realized that there was nothing he could do. She wouldn't let go of him, so he carried her up and went out to get some water and medicine. When he returned to the bedroom, he let her sit in his arms and take the medicine. She felt it was too bitter. Tang Yu had no choice but to keep it in his mouth. He kissed her lips and fed it to her. She wanted to spit it out, but he used a little more force to stop her from moving. Pei Chichi was forced to swallow it, but she did not let him feel better. She bit him hard. Not only did she bite him, but she also wrapped herself around him. Her tongue was soft and fragrant. He almost could not control himself. Tang Yu felt that he had never treated anyone this well in his life. Not even Tang Xin had ever fed him a pill. But when it came to Pei Chichi, she was like a mother to him. After taking the medicine, Pei Chichi settled down a little and fell asleep on the bed. Tang Yu sat by the bed and put down the glass in his hand. He looked at her for a long time before he stood up. He took his phone and walked out of the room. He called Meng Qing Cheng. "Do you know how to cook?" Meng Qing Cheng was drinking at a bar. When he heard this, he almost spat out the wine. "What? Cook? I'm a personal assistant, not a maid." Meng Qing Cheng took out a cigarette and held it between his fingers. He looked at the little wild cat beside him to stop it from crawling on his body. Tang Yu had already walked to the kitchen. Do you know how to cook or not? His voice sounded colder. Meng Qingcheng lowered his head and lit the cigarette. He took a puff. I only know how to cook porridge. Tang Yu frowned. Porridge then. How do you cook it? The cigarette in Meng Qingcheng's hand trembled and he almost burned his fingers. Was Tang Yu really going to cook? Was he kidding? You cook. Meng Qingcheng finally found his tongue. Tang Yu grunted lightly and took out a pot. Tell me, what do you want to do? Meng Qingcheng cursed in his heart. This was the first time he had to ask someone how to cook, and this was the first time he had sex, but he didn't call him to ask him how to do it. However, there were still things that Tang Yu didn't know how to do. Meng Qingcheng was lying on the sofa, holding a cigarette between his fingers. He instructed slowly, wash the rice first. Yes, wash it twice. Otherwise, it won't be nutritious. Without any nutrients, after Pei Chichi ate it, it wouldn't feel good in her hands anymore. Meng Qingcheng smiled gloomily. The woman beside him had become a decoration. On the other side, Tang Yu, who was a top student, spent half an hour cooking a pot of very good porridge. After turning off the fire, he went back to check on Pei Chichi. She was still asleep. Tang Yu propped his hands on the headboard and called out to her in a low voice, Chichi, get up and eat something. She woke up a little and buried her little face in the blanket again. She even stretched out her fair and tender little hand and slapped his face. This was the first time that President Tang Yu had been hit by someone, let alone a woman. His face was a little dark as he looked at her little hand that slid down his face. His face was full of black lines, but he didn't argue with her on account that she was a patient. She wrapped the blanket tightly around her, but she was still very cold and her little face was a little pale. Tang Yu bent down again. Baby. His face was a little hot when he called her that. He wasn't a sentimental person and had never called anyone that before. Pei Chichi's voice was muffled. It hurts. His entire body was in pain, and he felt very cold. Chapter 77. His heart skipped a beat. After some thought, he slid under the blanket. Just as he lay down, a pair of soft hands wrapped around his waist and her face was buried in his chest. She sighed, probably because it was too comfortable. Her petite body was curled up tightly. Her petite body was tightly embedded in his. Her petite feet were pressed against his and her face was buried in his neck. However, this was not enough. She was still cold. Tang Yu hugged her tightly, placing his large palm on her back and patting her gently. Pei Chichi did not sleep well. Her dreams were very messy. One moment, Zhu Meilin called her a little bitch. The next moment, Pei Ming placed her on his shoulder. The scene changed. Zhao Ku's beautiful face appeared in front of her. She was smiling at her and her voice could be heard clearly. Pei Chichi, I'm not your mother. I don't want you anymore, Mommy. Mommy. Pei Chichi's hands were clenched tightly. Her head was swaying uncontrollably because of the nightmare. No, her mother was not like that. Pei Ming had said that her mother loved her very much. Tears flowed from the corner of her eyes and stained Tang Yu's bathrobe. His heart was warm and wet. It was very uncomfortable, but he felt that he was very close to her. He did not fall asleep and kept watching over her. At this moment, she was crying hard and her body was covered in sweat. He patted her and woke her up. Chichi, you're dreaming. After much difficulty, she finally calmed down. She looked around, but her eyes were still blank. Tang Yu took the little one out of his arms. Do you want some porridge? Pei Chichi looked at him with her eyes wide open. Her eyes looked as though they had been washed by water. They were dark and bright and wet. Her black hair was also wet with sweat as though she had been fished out of the water. After a while, she asked him softly, what time is it? Tang Yu grabbed the bedside watch and looked at it. It's 1:00. Pei Chichi tried to sit up, but she did not have the strength to do so. She slid down again. Only then did he feel his back drenched in sweat. It was extremely uncomfortable. I want to take a bath, she whispered, biting her lip. Tang Yu smiled. Sure. He carried her to take a shower, changed into a clean set of pajamas, and carried her back. Pei Chichi sat on the bed and looked at his back. Sorry to trouble you. Her voice was soft, but he still heard it. Tang Yu turned around. Chichi, I've said that we'll be living together during this period of time. Don't overthink it. She looked at him and said nothing, but the light in her eyes was not as bright as before. He quietly watched for a while, then went to the kitchen to heat up the porridge again. After testing that it was not too hot, he scooped a small bowl and brought it to the bedroom. Pei Chichi was naturally too embarrassed to let him feed her, so she brought it over herself. However, she did not have a good appetite and could not eat any more after eating half a bowl. Tang Yu didn't force it. He ate a bowl and returned to his bedroom. She was extremely tired and the temperature had dropped, but she was still a little afraid of the cold. She curled up in Tang Yu's arms, but she could not fall asleep. However, Pei Chichi did not dare to move, for fear of waking him up. After maintaining this for a long time, Pei Chichi finally could not help but want to peek at him to see if he had fallen asleep. However, as soon as she lifted her head, a tragedy happened. The top of her head crashed straight into his chin. With a muffled groan, she hurriedly leaned back. Chapter 78. She took a deep breath and wanted to step back. If it wasn't for a big hand holding her waist, she would have already fallen down. Pei Chichi. Tang Yu angrily called her name, but his actions were gentle as he pulled her back and placed her in his arms. Pei Chichi didn't dare to look at him. She looked down and said, "I'm sorry. Can't sleep." He rubbed his chin as he looked at her. Pei Chichi replied with a millimeter. Actually, she couldn't sleep, but she didn't dare to. She was afraid to dream of Zhao Ku again. That feeling was too real and too scary. She would rather talk to him, even though she knew how dangerous it was to lie together with a man. But now, to Pei Chichi, Tang Yu was like a piece of driftwood. She wanted to hold on to him with all her might. She walked forward carefully and rubbed his chin gently. Tang Yu's eyes were locked on her little face. "What's wrong today?" Pei Chichi looked up and lowered her head again. Nothing. Obviously, she couldn't lie to him. Tang Yu's fingers gently pinched her beautiful little chin and forced her to look up at him. "Pei Chichi, why are you out in the rain?" When he saw her, his heart skipped a beat. He was afraid that something had happened to her. His sharp gaze made it impossible for her to hide. Pei Chichi wanted to turn her face away, but his fingers pinned her down and forced her to look at him forcefully. "Because of school." She lied. She looked up at him anxiously and lowered her eyelids again. Her eyelids were pink from crying. Her drooping eyelids fluttered, and she looked indescribably lovable. Tang Yu studied her expression carefully. Finally, he let go of her. "Chichi, you can tell me if there's anything." He couldn't give her marriage, but he could give her everything else. She understood his feelings. Her heart was a little confused, but something was coming out. She stared at him in a daze, but in her heart, she was thinking, "Tang Yu, there's still one thing that you can't change for me, and that's my birth." The lights were switched off again, and he hugged her. Her temperature had returned to normal, just like a heating pad. Hugging a small one in his arms gave him an indescribable sense of satisfaction. Tang Yu didn't have the chance to own a doll when he was young, but seeing how Tang Xin loved to hug it to sleep, he guessed that this was the feeling. In his arms, Pei Chichi's little hand slipped into his loosened collar. She felt a little restless. Tang Yu grabbed her hand and said in a hoarse voice, "Chichi." Pei Chichi broke free from his hand. Not only did she not stop, she even buried her little face in it. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the little person in his arms. She was lying in his arms with her black hair draped over her fair shoulders. She had a wild beauty. Tang Yu felt like his whole body was on fire, and he had no way to release it. His large palm slid through her hair, and he still retained a trace of rationality. "Chichi." His voice was unbelievably hoarse. She was still sick, and he couldn't do this to her. However, Pei Chichi looked up, and then her little face moved downwards. With a loud bang, all of Tang Yu's defenses collapsed. The only rational thing left was, he wanted her. He suddenly turned around and pressed her down. Her hand was raised high, and his long slender fingers slowly intertwined with hers. Their bodies were firm and firm. Tang Yu exhaled with difficulty. "I'll hurt you." Pei Chichi closed her eyes and kissed him. Chapter 79. Even though he knew that she had something on her mind, and even though he knew that it wasn't a good time, he still couldn't take it when such a delicate little person threw herself into his arms and begged him to love her. Tang Yu was just an ordinary man, and he couldn't resist such temptation. He gave in to the desire in his heart, but because of her body, he only dared to do it gently twice. When he was done, he turned to the side and pulled her little body into his arms. After a while, he looked down at Pei Chichi in his arms. She looked as if she had just been fished out of the water. The sweat on her forehead was stuck to her little face, and her body was also covered in a thin layer of sweat, which was a little sticky. Tang Yu reached out to brush her hair aside and moved closer. At this moment, her whole body was fragrant and soft. He kissed her on the lips and said hoarsely, "Go take a shower." She moaned weakly and opened her eyes to look at him for a while. Then, she closed her eyes weakly and replied softly, "Millimeter." It was already 3 o'clock when Tang Yu carried her back to bed after the shower. Even he was a little exhausted, and he fell into a deep sleep while hugging Pei Chichi. The next morning, it was expected that they would sleep late. When Pei Chichi opened her eyes, she saw Tang Yu leaning against the headboard in his bathrobe. He was talking to Xiao Ran on the phone. He lowered his head to see that Pei Chichi had woken up. He smiled faintly and said a few words before hanging up. "You're awake." Pei Chichi was still looking at him. She didn't want to move at all because her body felt as if it had been dismantled. Her whole body was aching. Tang Yu reached out and placed his hand on her forehead. He said calmly, "You're not having a fever anymore, but you still have to take the medicine twice." As he said that, he lifted the blanket and was about to get out of bed. Pei Chichi's little hand grabbed the corner of his shirt. Tang Yu was a little surprised. He turned to look at her and smiled. "I helped you apply for leave from school." "No." Pei Chichi's voice was unbelievably hoarse. She didn't know why she grabbed him, but she just felt that she wanted someone to accompany her at this moment. Even if it was Tang Yu, even if he wanted her body. Tang Yu sighed and went back to lying down. Pei Chichi proactively placed her little face on his waist. His heart softened a little. He reached out to stroke her black hair and smiled. "What's wrong?" Pei Chichi shook her head and just lay on him. Tang Yu patted her. "I'll go get the medicine. Be good." However, it was rare for her to be disobedient. Her little hands hugged him instead. But very quickly, she felt that his body was quietly changing. Regarding this, Tang Yu was also a little embarrassed. At this moment, when she was so dependent on him, he went berserk. He was a little annoyed, but he couldn't bear to be fierce with her. He just pulled her away from his body and went outside to pour some water and bring the medicine back. Pei Chichi didn't want to be unreasonable anymore. She sat up and took the medicine. Tang Yu took the cup. "Have breakfast and sleep for a while." It was only 9 o'clock. He had only slept for 6 hours. Pei Chichi looked up at him and asked in a daze, "Aren't you going to the office?" Tang Yu said very naturally, "Oh, I'm a little tired. I'll go in the afternoon." Pei Chichi remembered what happened last night. Her face was a little hot, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Tang Yu came over and patted her. "Go wash up and have breakfast." Pei Chichi lifted the blanket and got out of bed. She felt dizzy and sat back down. Chapter 80. Tang Yu reached out to carry her. Pei Chichi exclaimed and hugged his neck. She lowered her head and could see his handsome face. There was a light green stubble on his smooth chin, which made him look very sexy. Moving up, there were thin lips with a beautiful shape. He looked especially handsome in the morning light. Pei Chichi's heart raced. She lowered her eyes and did not dare to look at him again. Tang Yu carried her to the washroom and put her down. "I'll wait for you outside." Her face heated up and she replied softly, "Millimeter." Tang Yu was a man who valued his privacy, so he gave her some space and stood outside for a while. Pei Chichi turned on the cold water and splashed it on her face. Only then did she feel better. She looked up at herself in the mirror, but her face overlapped with Zhao Ku's. They had the same face. Pei Chichi's expression became pained and her eyes were filled with hurt. She splashed cold water on her face like crazy. She would rather not have such a face. She would rather not know that she had a mother named Zhao Ku. Tang Yu leaned against the door silently. His brows were slightly furrowed as he looked at Pei Chichi's hysterical look. She looked up and saw Tang Yu in the mirror. Her face was covered in cold water as she stared at him. She looked extremely pathetic. After a long time, Pei Chichi's voice sounded a little absent-minded. Tang Yu, we shouldn't be together. He stood there without much of an expression on his face. Pei Chichi stared at him in the mirror. She stubbornly stared at him until her body slowly collapsed. The heavy rain caused Pei Chichi to get pneumonia and stay in the hospital for half a month. After her condition stabilized, Tang Yu hired an auntie to take care of her. The auntie took good care of her, and he would occasionally visit her. Pei Chichi did not dare to tell Pei Ming as she was afraid that he would be worried. She was even more afraid that he would find out about her relationship with Tang Yu. The last time she and Tang Yu appeared in the newspaper, Zhu Meilin had purposely stopped Pei Ming from knowing. On Friday, the fourth day in the hospital, Chen Xinjie called. Pei Chichi looked down at the name on the phone and was stunned for a while before picking it up. Xinjie. Chen Xinjie sounded a little anxious. Chichi, you haven't come to school for a few days. I heard from the teacher that you're on sick leave. Yes. Pei Chichi smiled. I'll be going to class in a few days. Chen Xinjie paused for a moment, probably because her attitude wasn't too warm. Then she asked carefully, Chichi, can I come over to see you? Pei Chichi didn't reply immediately. Chichi, what's wrong? Aren't we best friends? Chen Xinjie sounded a little disappointed. Pei Chichi lowered her eyes. Of course we are. Chen Xinjie smiled and returned to her usual carefree self. Then I'll come over later. She hung up before Pei Chichi could say anything. Putting down the phone, Pei Chichi got off the bed and walked to the French windows. From here, the view was very good. She could see half of B City. The hospital's VIP rooms were fully equipped. Staying here was no different from staying in Xia City. Come to think of it, Tang Yu was really, really good to her. So good that she couldn't repay him. Pei Chichi stood there quietly without much expression on her face. Chapter 81. Auntie Li was in her 50s and had a daughter abroad. She was a nice person. She helped Pei Chichi back to the bed and scolded her as she walked. Look at your face. It's still yellow. You don't know how to rest. If Mr. Tang finds out, you'll have to get your butt pumped. Auntie Li only knew that Tang Yu was Pei Chichi's boyfriend. She was scaring her with a straight face, but she was also full of love. Pei Chichi smiled and lay back down with Auntie Li's help. She closed her eyes and said softly, Auntie Li, I just want to stand for a while. Auntie Li tucked her in and said in a gentle voice, Mr. Tang told me not to get out of bed for a few days. You can wait until the doctor says it's okay. Then, she smiled mysteriously. Mr. Tang loves you so much. He's handsome and rich. It's hard to find a man like him. You have to take advantage of him. Naturally, Pei Chichi wouldn't say much. She just lifted the corner of her lips. Auntie Li sat by the bed and peeled a pear for her. Mr. Tang called and said he'll come over tonight. Pei Chichi was stunned. He came over twice during the 4 days she was in the hospital. Tonight was the third time. Actually, he brought her to warm his bed. He didn't have to be so concerned about her when she was sick. Pei Chichi didn't say anything. Auntie Li pinched her gently and complained, Why can't you be more attentive? Pei Chichi said oh. Auntie Li smiled. That's right. Mr. Tang is a good partner. As they were talking, the door opened and Chen Xinjie stood at the door. When Pei Chichi looked over, she stuck out her tongue and said, Chichi, this ward is bigger than my house. Pei Chichi smiled faintly. School is over. Chen Xinjie ran in and sat by the bed. She grabbed Pei Chichi's hand and said, Chichi, how are you? Pei Chichi sat up and said, I'm fine. It's acute pneumonia. Is it serious? Is it contagious? Chen Xinjie covered her mouth and asked softly. With a smile in her eyes, Pei Chichi leaned over to Chen Xinjie and said slowly, The doctor said it's contagious. Chen Xinjie's eyes widened in fear. I lied to you. Pei Chichi leaned back and laughed. Although her face was still pale, the mischievous look on her face made it more lively. Chen Xinjie covered her chest and let out a long sigh. Chichi, you're so bad. Pei Chichi smiled, but there was no trace of a smile in her eyes. Xinjie, how I wish that you weren't the one who betrayed me. Auntie Li thought that the two girls had a good relationship. She stood up with a smile and said, "You guys talk." Seeing that Pei Chichi was happy, she was also happy in her heart. She was a little girl, so it was better to be lively. Chen Xinjie brought Pei Chichi her class notes, as well as a piece of shocking news: Pei Huan was pregnant. Pei Chichi was stunned. She's pregnant after just one time. Chichi, is there any justice in this world? Moreover, she didn't have a miscarriage after being beaten up by you. Chen Xinjie's face was full of indignation. She stared at Pei Chichi's face and said, "I feel that Pei Huan's child is a little strange." Pei Chichi interrupted her. "She and Lin Jinrong are engaged. Don't say such things in the future. Chichi, I'm feeling indignant for you." Lin Jinrong. Chen Xinjie sounded agitated. Chapter 82. Pei Chichi's heart skipped a beat, and Chen Xinjie shut up in time. She moved her lips and coughed softly. "Chichi, I'll go back first." She picked up her backpack, nodded at Tang Yu, and didn't leave. Auntie Li was perceptive. She smiled when she saw Tang Yu coming over. "Mr. Tang is here. I'll go back first." Tang Yu walked with her to the door. He seemed to say something before Auntie Li left. Pei Chichi felt uneasy. She didn't know how much Tang Yu had heard. Tang Yu closed the door, walked over and sat by her bed. He placed his hand on her forehead. "Are you feeling better today?" He paused. "I heard from Auntie Li that you got out of bed." His voice was a little questioning. Pei Chichi felt relieved and said, "I've been lying down for a long time. I feel dizzy." He chuckled. "You can wait for me to carry you down." As he said that, he ruffled her hair, which also messed up her heart. Just when she was a little confused, Tang Yu said calmly, "Just now, you mentioned Jinrong? What's wrong with him?" Pei Chichi looked up at him and said slowly, "Pei Huan is pregnant." Tang Yu frowned slightly and stared at her for a long time. She didn't know what he was thinking and felt a little uneasy. All of a sudden, his large palm was placed on her waist. Pei Chichi felt uneasy and moved slightly. His voice was a little low. "Do you want to get pregnant?" Her eyes suddenly widened as she stared at him in disbelief. Tang Yu smiled gently. With her young body, if he wanted to get her pregnant, it wouldn't take a few months. He didn't reject a child between him and Pei Chichi, but he wouldn't force her to give birth to a child for him. She was obviously scared out of her wits. After a long time, she asked softly, "What if I accidentally get pregnant?" He had sex with her frequently. Although he had always taken precautions, there were always accidents when it came to this kind of thing. Pei Chichi had never thought about it before. Now that he mentioned it, she could not help but wonder. She did not want her child to be like her one day. No one wanted it. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at her dazed face. She must have been frightened. His slender and good-looking fingers were still moving slowly around her waist. Pei Chichi's little hand grabbed his. Tang Yu. She rarely called him that, and she had never offended him in such a way. She treated him almost as an equal. Tang Yu was also in a daze. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, one hand pressing down on her fluffy little head. "If you're pregnant, give birth." She was stunned. She wanted to raise her head to look at him, but he pressed her down and didn't let her move. Then he said slowly, "Pei Chichi, we'll get married then." Pei Chichi was completely stunned. His hands pressed her even tighter, until her whole body was buried in his arms. His body was very warm. Pei Chichi's little hand hesitated, but finally hugged his body. He lowered his head to find her little mouth and kissed her. Then he pried open her mouth and tangled with her. "Don't." Her voice was crushed by him and swallowed up by him. It was contagious. She didn't have the chance to say the last 3 words. He kissed her again and again. Just now, Tang Yu made a decision. Chapter 83. However, he did not say it out loud as he did not want to scare her. After this kiss, something seemed to have changed. Pei Chichi's legs were still weak, but she moved from the bed to his lap. He was really not afraid of infecting her, so he kept hugging her, even when he was reading the documents. "I'm tired." Pei Chichi could not help but protest. She was a patient, not a study companion. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at her. He smiled and let go of her body. I'll cook some porridge for you. Pei Chichi looked at his back view and felt a little uneasy. Tang Yu, you don't have to be so nice to me. He did not turn back but went to the kitchen. From that day on, Tang Yu spent the night in the ward, and sometimes he would even stay in the hospital during the day. Meng Qingcheng could not help but complain, do you have to be like this? She's just a little girl. I don't think she has any tricks that can make you dizzy, right? Tang Yu looked down at the documents and replied calmly, I don't want her to know those things. When he said this, he paused for a moment, and his heart skipped a beat. He had always been the one serving her in the bed. Even the last time she took the initiative when she was sick, he was also the one who served her. What are you thinking about? Meng Qingcheng sighed. It's not like you haven't seen women before. Look at how precious you are now. He did not care so much about her in the beginning. Tang Yu looked up at him. But the only one I've done it with is Pei Chichi. Meng Qingcheng understood. He blinked his eyes. Well, don't you want to try something else? Maybe it will work. In the past, Tang Yu could not touch women. But now that he could touch Pei Chichi, maybe others could touch her too? When he said that, Tang Yu just glanced at him. Meng Qingcheng knew in his heart that Tang Yu was not interested. Pei Chichi is beautiful, but she probably doesn't have much experience in that area. Meng Qingcheng couldn't understand why Tang Yu would choose Pei Chichi with his qualities. In this regard, Tang Yu did not explain anything. He had never liked to confess his own affairs. He tidied up the documents on the table. Meng Qingcheng sighed slightly. Going back to serve Pei Chichi again? Business trip. Special Assistant Meng, did you forget about going to H City? Tang Yu said indifferently. Meng Qingcheng almost forgot. He jumped off the table and said, I really forgot. Tang Yu snorted, picked up his briefcase and walked out. Xiao Ran immediately followed him. President, the private plane is waiting. When Tang Yu sat on the private plane, he took out his mobile phone and dialed Pei Chichi's number. I'm going on a business trip for 3 days. Aunt Li will come to cook at home. Pei Chichi had been discharged from the hospital. At this time, she was sitting on the bed with her long hair draped over her shoulders. She was only wearing pajamas. She hummed. Tang Yu was silent for a while before he smiled softly. Be obedient. He said these 2 words very softly, but it tugged at her heartstrings. Pei Chichi's face was a little hot. She couldn't say anything. She could only wait for him to hang up the phone first. Tang Yu stopped teasing her and hung up the phone. In fact, he was really busy these days. But in order to take care of Pei Chichi, he compressed his itinerary. He didn't need a direct flight to H City, but now. He shook his head and smiled. On the other side, Pei Chichi hung up the phone. Aunt Li came over with a stewed pear. Is it Mr. Tang? Pei Chichi hummed. Chapter 84. But Mr. Tang was really nice to Pei Chichi, and maybe they would get married in the future. Here, have a pear. It clears the lungs. Auntie Li put it in front of her. Pei Chichi smiled and ate it in small bites. I'm taking a nap. Mr. Tang told me to. Auntie Li treated Tang Yu's words as an imperial edict. Pei Chichi lay down and buried her face in the quilt. She said in a muffled voice, I'm going to sleep. Aren't you afraid that Mr. Tang will feel bad for you? Auntie Li loosened the quilt for Pei Chichi and went out to do her own things. After the door closed, Pei Chichi's little face appeared. She looked at the door and touched the place where Auntie Li touched. It was still warm. She looked at it in a daze and lay back down. When she fell asleep, she dreamed of Zhao Ke's beautiful face again, holding a check and asking her to leave Tang Yu. Mom, Mom. Pei Chichi broke out in a cold sweat and felt hot all over. When a hand touched her forehead, she threw herself into that person's arms without hesitation. Auntie Li was stunned at first, but after a while, she hugged the girl in her arms lovingly. She must be having a nightmare. Her little body trembled in her arms, and it was indescribably adorable. Mom. Pei Chichi still called out softly, and big tears slowly fell from the corners of her eyes. Only at this time could she cry freely. Auntie Li patted her little shoulder and comforted her. Pei Chichi only calmed down after a long time. Auntie Li didn't ask anything, but she felt pity for such a beautiful girl. Fortunately, Mr. Tang loved her, but no matter how much he loved her, he couldn't replace her biological mother. Mr. Tang can replace her biological father, laugh shamelessly Tilda. Pei Chichi went to take a bath and felt much better when she came out. The next day, Auntie Li went back. Pei Chichi sat on the sofa by the window and stared outside in a daze. Suddenly, she got up, changed her clothes, grabbed her bag, and walked out. They hailed a taxi and arrived at a high-class residential area with a nice name, Yanghui. In front of the European-style villa, there was a white goddess statue in the middle of the huge lawn, surrounded by little angels, and behind her was a fountain. Pei Chichi saw Zhao Ku and a girl about 15 or 16 years old. The girl was very good-looking. She had a princess hairstyle and wore a pure thunder princess dress. In front of her was an easel. She was painting an oil painting with Zhao Ku by her side. At this moment, Zhao Ku's gaze was very gentle. Her fingers tapped on the oil painting and occasionally looked at the girl. Her expression was very different from the last time she saw her. Pei Chichi stood there, staring blankly, feeling numb all over. It turned out that her mother was also gentle and loving. Zhao Ku looked up and saw Pei Chichi. Her gaze immediately sharpened, and then she lowered her head and said something to the girl. The girl looked up at Pei Chichi with a puzzled expression, but she still walked into the villa. Zhao Ku walked out and went straight to the point. "Did you change your mind?" Pei Chichi didn't say anything, but just looked at her. Zhao Ku was a little annoyed. Pei Chichi's gaze made her feel very uncomfortable. Chapter 85. At this moment, this bastard actually appeared by Tang Yu's side. Even if it was just for fun, she wouldn't allow it. Zhao Ku didn't panic like before. She turned her body and looked at the mansion behind her. Her gaze then landed on Pei Chichi's little face. She said coldly, "You've seen it for yourself. Without you, Tang Xin and I are living a good life. I don't want to lose everything. Pei Chichi, please don't destroy my happiness." Pei Chichi subconsciously repeated her words. Happiness, so her other daughter was called Tang Xin. Tang Xin, who was like a princess. And her surname was Pei. Pei Chichi chuckled. "You've never thought of me, have you?" Her face was filled with longing. She had never had a mother. She had only seen Pei Huan being lovingly held in Zhu Meilin's arms, while Pei Huan had called her a bitch. Pei Chichi remembered that when she was young, she didn't really understand what it meant to be a little bitch. She didn't even know that she wasn't Zhu Meilin's biological daughter. She just thought that if she did better, Auntie Zhu would like her. Would she kiss her like how she did to Pei Huan? It wasn't until she understood why Pei Huan called Zhu Meilin mom and she called her auntie that she knew that Zhu Meilin would never kiss her. Zhao Ku's heart skipped a beat when she saw the expression on Pei Chichi's face. It wasn't that she didn't feel Pei Chichi's emotions, but how could she be so easily soft-hearted? Doing that with Pei Ming while she was pregnant with Pei Chichi was the greatest humiliation of her life. Zhao Ku's face was cold. "No." Pei Chichi paused for a moment. Then she took a step back and laughed at herself. "I thought so too." She turned around and slowly walked back in the direction she came from. Zhao Ku saw that she was about to leave. She took a step forward and grabbed Pei Chichi's slender wrist tightly. "Leave Tang Yu." Pei Chichi looked up at Zhao Ku's beautiful face. At this moment, it was a little distorted from anxiety. How could this be a mother's face? How could she yearn for warmth from her body? She shook Zhao Ku off forcefully and sneered, "Madam Zhao, don't worry. I won't tell anyone that you're my mother, because that would be a humiliation to me." Zhao Ku was stunned for a moment. Pei Chichi had already broken free. Pei Chichi walked very quickly, and Zhao Ku just stood there. She stared at the beautiful back view, her heart palpitating. If, when she was pregnant with Chichi, that person could look at her more and comfort her gently, then perhaps she would also love this child. But no, that person didn't want her child. Time and time again, he didn't want her child. Zhao Ku thought of Tang Xin. Tang Xin's illness. For a moment, she wanted to keep Pei Chichi. Perhaps Pei Chichi's bone marrow would be compatible with Tang Xin's. Perhaps Tang Xin's illness would be cured, But it was only for a moment. She changed her mind. No, she couldn't take the risk. She couldn't let others find out about her relationship with Pei Chichi. She couldn't let Jiyuan find out about Tang Xin's parentage. Once she was found out, she would have nothing left. At that moment, wealth won over family. Zhao Ku had once abandoned Pei Chichi. Now, to a certain extent, she had also abandoned Tang Xin. Chapter 86. Zhao Ku snapped out of her daze and stared at Tang Xin for a long while. Tang Xin was startled and waved her hand in front of Zhao Ku. "Mom!" Zhao Ku snapped out of her daze and said calmly, "It's your brothers, mistress." Tang Xin was still young, but she understood what it meant to be in mistress. Her mother used to be her father's mistress, but my brother isn't married yet. She should be his girlfriend. Tang Xin bit her lower lip and asked in confusion. This stung Zhao Ku's heart. She used to be the most beautiful woman in B City, but she didn't come from a good family, so she could only be a mistress, but the man she had loved had always been that one. That person was so illustrious, but he had never paid attention to her. Don't ask, kid. Don't tell your father about this, lest he gets upset, okay? Zhao Ku instructed. Tang Xin nodded obediently and went back to her painting. Zhao Ku looked at her beautiful profile, and was a little stunned. Pei Chichi looked more like her, but Tang Xin looked like that man. Zhao Ku's eyes flashed with pain. The past was like a huge wave crashing into her. Pei Chichi walked home for more than 2 hours. Auntie Li was so worried that she went crazy. When she saw Pei Chichi, she scolded, "You didn't even bring your phone. You went out for so long. You must have worried me to death." Pei Chichi looked at Auntie Li's fierce face in a daze. She was her biological mother. Why didn't any strangers care about her? They didn't even ask her how she was all these years. Auntie Li coughed lightly. "All right, I'll forgive you this time, but don't do this again." Pei Chichi reached out and hugged her. "Auntie Li, can I call you mommy?" Auntie Li was stunned. She reached out and caressed Pei Chichi in her arms. "You can call me whatever you want." Pei Chichi grabbed Auntie Li's arm with both hands and smiled. "I'll make chicken noodles for you. Tang Yu loves it." She ran into the kitchen happily, and Auntie Li watched from behind. Her heart ached. He felt that it was not easy for this little girl. It was already 3 days after Tang Yu returned. Pei Chichi was watching TV with Auntie Li. She had already gone to class during the day. The door opened, and the chauffeur brought Tang Yu's luggage up and left. Tang Yu slowly closed the door, took off his coat and threw it aside. Pei Chichi stared at him in a daze. She had already forgotten that today was the day he came back. Auntie Li had good eyesight. She stood up and said with a smile, "Mr. Tang, you haven't eaten yet, right? I'll go get some. Chichi's chicken noodles are really good." Chichi did it. Tang Yu unbuttoned his shirt and changed his shoes. He looked at Pei Chichi. Her heart was beating a little fast, and she just stared at him in a daze. Auntie Li smiled and went to the kitchen. Tang Yu walked over and sat on the sofa armrest beside her. He leaned over and kissed her little mouth. His voice was deep and husky. "I thought you would only make it for me." As he said that, he patted her little p***ness as if he was punishing her. Pei Chichi almost jumped up. Auntie Li heated up the noodles and removed her apron. "I'll go back first then." Chapter 87. Don't send me off. Spend more time with Mr. Tang. He's really nice to you, Auntie Li added. At her age, she could clearly see that Pei Chichi was with Tang Yu. Even if they didn't get married in the end, there would be no problems with their lives in the future. Pei Chichi nodded and closed the door after Auntie Li entered the elevator. As soon as she turned around, Tang Yu said, "Come here." Pei Chichi was stunned, but she still walked to him obediently. Her slender waist was held by his large palm, and her entire body was sitting on his lap. Tang Yu put down the chopsticks in his hand. In fact, he hadn't started eating yet. Held by him like this, Pei Chichi did not dare to move, nor did she dare to look at him. Her head hung low. "Chichi." He lifted her chin and forced her to look up. Pei Chichi looked up. Her eyes were misty, and when she saw the jade gaze in his eyes, She hurriedly lowered her eyes. He chuckled and let her go. He patted her and said in a hoarse voice, "Go fill the bath." She said, "Oh," and ran away quickly. While filling the bath, she helped him pack his luggage. However, she saw a delicate box at the bottom of the suitcase. She was a little stunned. "It's for you. Open it and see." She didn't know when, but he leaned against the dressing room door and said lightly. Pei Chichi looked up at him and opened the box. There was a delicate necklace inside. It was a very retro style with complicated golden lines around it. There was a rich jade in the middle, which looked very valuable. Tang Yu lifted her hair and put the necklace on for her. He looked at it in the mirror and smiled. "It suits you very well." Jadeite wasn't actually suitable for young girls, but it looked surprisingly good on Pei Chichi's little neck. Pei Chichi gently stroked the necklace with his fingers. He had a feeling that this necklace wasn't something he had bought on the spot. Of course, he wouldn't tell her that he had gotten it from his grandfather, Lin Yun's father, when he went to H City. This was something that his grandmother had treasured for a long time. Before she left, she told him that if he ever had the idea of starting a family, he should give this necklace to the girl so that she wouldn't be able to run away. Actually, Tang Yu had a better idea, which was to get Pei Chichi pregnant. However, she was still too young. She was only 20 years old, so it was not suitable for her to have a child. Letting go of her hair, he leaned over and kissed her soft neck. His voice was a little hoarse. "Shower together?" Pei Chichi's face was slightly red, but she didn't move. Tang Yu picked her up and walked straight to the bathroom. Maybe it was because she had been sick for a long time, or maybe it was because he hadn't seen her for 3 days, so he couldn't control himself in the bathroom. Half coaxing and half forcing, he succeeded. Pei Chichi hugged his neck and begged him in a broken voice, "Go in." She couldn't finish the word room. He bit her little ear and smiled wickedly. "Baby, I'm here." She balled her hand into a fist and punched him hard on the back. Tang Yu chuckled and moved closer to her ear. His hot breath blew on her little ear. "Either here or in the bedroom. You're on top." Chapter 88. Pei Chichi couldn't stand it, but she didn't want to do it so blatantly. Actually, he hadn't stopped all this while and was torturing her. She had no choice. It was useless to beg him. Finally, she pleaded softly, "Go to the room." He got what he wanted and carried her to the room. Just as he was about to dote on her, the doorbell rang. Tang Yu cursed under his breath. His body tensed up. He didn't care about anything else, but the doorbell was still ringing relentlessly. She pushed his shoulders with her soft hands and said in a broken voice, "Someone's here." He lowered his head and leaned against her neck, saying passionately, "Don't worry." At this moment, she was so fragrant and soft. He was willing to die on top of her. Why would he think about it? "Tang Yu." She patted him with her little hands. She couldn't bear to do it anymore. He lowered his head and looked at the beautiful face in his arms. He heaved a sigh of relief and finally got up to leave her. He casually grabbed a bathrobe and put it on. Before he walked out, he turned back and said, "Don't go out yet." Pei Chichi was resting with her eyes closed. Her little face was a little flushed and her eyelids were pink. She looked weak and weak. She grunted when she heard him. Tang Yu looked at her silently for a while before walking to the door to open it. The person who came was unexpected. It was Lin Jinrong. "Jinrong." Tang Yu opened the door slowly. At the same time, he could smell the faint smell of alcohol on Lin Jinrong. He frowned. "You drank." Lin Jinrong was wearing jeans and a white shirt with his jacket over his shoulders. He smiled faintly and walked in. "Yeah, I drank a little." "Brother Tang Yu, you slept?" His gaze fell on Tang Yu. As a man, he could acutely feel the scent of love jade on Tang Yu. The jade in his eyes had not completely faded. This was different from the Tang Yu he knew. Brother Tang Yu was usually serious and dignified. He had never seen him so, like a normal man. And the girl who turned him into a normal man was none other than Pei Chichi. Lin Jinrong watched for a long time, but Tang Yu had already closed the door. He walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water for Lin Jinrong. They sat on the sofa together. "I heard that Pei Huan is pregnant." The corners of Lin Jinrong's lips twitched forcefully. He lowered his head to look at the water in the cup and looked up. Can you have a drink with me? He knew that Pei Chichi was in the bedroom. It was possible that she was under Tang Yu's body just now. They were interrupted by him. Lin Jinrong did not know why he came here. Perhaps he was unwilling, or perhaps he wanted him to give up. Tang Yu looked at Lin Jinrong indifferently. After a long time, he smiled and said, "Of course." He stood up and went to the bar counter to open a bottle of aged red wine. He poured 2 glasses, but before he could bring them over, Lin Jinrong walked over. "Let's drink here." Lin Jinrong took out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and placed it on the bar counter. He lit it up skillfully and looked at Tang Yu. "Do you want one?" Tang Yu smiled faintly. "No need." He looked sideways at the bedroom door. It was tightly shut. He turned back and said, "Chichi had pneumonia a few days ago. I don't smoke at home." Lin Jinrong was stunned. His fingers that were holding the cigarette did not move for a long time. He stared at Tang Yu's eyes. Tang Yu did not avoid his gaze. His expression was still indifferent. "Chichi is Pei Huan's sister. You've met her." Chapter 89. Lin Jinrong's voice was dry. "You're together with her?" Tang Yu smiled. "Yes." Lin Jinrong didn't ask any more questions. He just took a deep puff of his cigarette, finished the wine in the glass, and poured himself a glass. Red wine couldn't get him drunk. The more he drank, the more sober he became. Tang Yu just took a sip and sat with him. "Brother Tang Yu, you said before that you want to find a girl you like to fall in love with and find a suitable woman to marry. Now, is Pei Chichi someone you like or someone suitable for you?" Lin Jinrong looked straight into Tang Yu's eyes. Tang Yu glanced at the empty wine bottle. Jinrong had drunk a little too much. He leaned against the wine cabinet, his expression a little lazy. "Jinrong, maybe I've found a girl I like and is suitable for me." His expression was lazy, but his gaze was sharp. Lin Jinrong was stunned. He didn't expect Tang Yu to say that. The air seemed to freeze. In this silence, the door to the room opened. Pei Chichi stood barefooted at the door in her pajamas and called out Tang Yu's name. Then her gaze froze when she saw Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong turned his head to look. His breathing seemed to have stopped. He just stared blankly at her in her pajamas. Was she going to lie with Tang Yu like this, naked? "Go in and change your clothes." Tang Yu's voice was a little strict, with a tinge of tension. Pei Chichi came back to her senses. Her gaze was still in a daze. She slowly responded with an "oh" and returned to the bedroom in slow motion. Her back was against the door, and her heart was beating rapidly. Although she knew that she would inevitably see Lin Jinrong from time to time when she was with Tang Yu, she didn't expect that Lin Jinrong would come here, and at night. She was a little embarrassed. Someone knocked on the door. She bounced up like a rabbit. Tang Yu's elegant voice came from the door. "Chichi, change your clothes and come out for a nap." She stared at the door and did not move for a long time. He knocked on the door again and left. Pei Chichi spent 10 minutes adjusting herself. She told herself that this kind of thing might happen more often in the future, and she had to get used to it. Lin Jinrong, Pei Huan, and Zhao Ku had put her relationship with Tang Yu in danger. She should have escaped. If Tang Yu found out about her feelings for Lin Jinrong and her relationship with Zhao Ku, she would be consigned to eternal damnation. At that time, would he still hold her in his arms to comfort her when she was afraid? Would he still coax her like an obedient child? She also admitted that she was selfish. She hid in the protective net woven by Tang Yu. When she went out, she didn't look at Lin Jinrong. She just smiled at Tang Yu. "I'm going downstairs." Lin Jinrong only glanced at her and didn't say anything. Tang Yu smiled faintly. "Chichi's chicken noodles are good. Jinrong, have an extra bowl later." Lin Jinrong was stunned and couldn't help but look at Tang Yu. Everyone in the Lin family knew that Tang Yu's favorite was Lin Yun's chicken noodles. Now he liked Pei Chichi's chicken noodles. Pei Chichi paused for a moment and walked into the kitchen. Lin Jinrong still didn't stay to eat the noodles. He was afraid that he couldn't digest it. He picked up his jacket and patted it. "I'm leaving." Tang Yu didn't stay either. He leaned against the wall and said, "Drive slowly." Chapter 90. Lin Jinrong smiled and looked in the direction of the kitchen. At this moment, Pei Chichi was wearing a pair of denim shorts. Her slender legs were fair and straight, and she was wearing a big t-shirt. Her hair was casually clipped up with a long clip, and her side profile looked very gentle under the light. She was like this, taking care of brother Tang Yu's business at home. Tang Yu did not move as he watched Lin Jinrong slowly close the door. Pei Chichi came over with 2 bowls of noodles. Tang Yu was the only one left at the bar. Jinrong is leaving first, he said lightly. Oh, Pei Chichi replied and quietly heaved a sigh of relief. She looked at the noodles on the table and asked, "What about this?" Tang Yu walked over. She thought that he wanted to eat the noodles, so she quietly pushed him to his usual seat. However, he stood and did not sit down. His long arm reached out and held her wrist. With a slight force, she fell into his arms. His kiss landed on her. It was a little urgent and a little fierce. Tang Yu. She clenched her little fist and gently hammered his shoulder. However, she could not move him no matter how hard she tried. He led her to the wine cabinet and stumbled. When she realized his intention, she struggled slightly and said in a voice like a kitten, "Not here." Tang Yu paused for a moment. His gaze was fixed on her eyes. His dark eyes seemed to be gathering a storm, and she almost drowned in it. He lowered his head and kissed her again. He murmured hoarsely beside her lips, "Do it here once." He tyrannically bullied her in this place, where Jinrong had stood before. Pei Chichi could not take it anymore. She cried softly, but she could not stop him. He did not let her off easily. After it was over, he carried her to the bedroom. Pei Chichi lay in his arms. It seemed that after doing it once, he was not as impatient as before. He seemed to be taking his time. He cupped her little face and said in a low voice, "Pei Chichi, do you like it when I do this to you?" She sat on his body helplessly and turned her face away. She trembled and refused to speak. He continued to provoke her even more, insisting that she tell him everything. "Tang Yu," she cried out in a small voice. She placed her small hand on his shoulder, not knowing what to do. Although she had done it with him before, she was still not used to the relationship between a man and a woman. Especially when that feeling came, she was extremely afraid. He tortured her with a heart of stone, and at last she wept softly and said, "Yes." Since she liked it, he wouldn't stand on ceremony. "Do you like it?" Her voice was broken, and she kept saying yes. "Pei Chichi, do you like me?" She closed her eyes and murmured, "I like it." Tang Yu suddenly pulled her into his arms. "Pei Chichi, since you like him, you can't change it. Remember, you said the word like to me." But she was in a daze, so how could she know about his dark thoughts? After a night of indulgence, Tang Yu was also a little exhausted. He was not in the mood to take a shower, so he fell asleep while hugging her. However, he woke up early in the morning. Today was Sheng Yuan's shareholders' meeting, and he would be hosting it. Pei Chichi was still asleep. He looked at her sleeping face as he put on his clothes. Perhaps because he was really fierce last night, there were still traces of tears at the corner of her eyes. Chapter 91. Tang Yu knew that he had lost control last night, and that it was because of Jinrong. He had always been successful since he was young. Other than Tang Jiyuan and Lin Yun's broken marriage, he had nothing to be envious of. But last night, he tasted jealousy. He was actually jealous of Jinrong. Perhaps Jinrong and Pei Chichi didn't show it too much. She was always very restrained. But as a man, he could still sense it. After tying his tie, he half knelt in front of her. Her long eyelashes trembled unnaturally. Tang Yu reached out and touched her little ear. "I'm going to work first." Pei Chichi didn't move. He smiled lightly and his thin lips pressed against the soft flesh behind her ear. He gently bit it and murmured, "There's still time. Do it once before you leave." She opened her eyes immediately and looked at him with a gaze that made his hair stand on end. "I've applied for leave for you. Auntie Lee came over too. Heat up your breakfast later." He kissed her forehead and ruffled her hair. Pei Chichi knew that she had been tricked and glared at him. This was the first time she had been so childish in front of him. Tang Yu's heart softened. The unhappiness from last night also dissipated a lot. He pinched her soft face and said, "If you keep looking at me like that, I really won't let you off." Pei Chichi pulled the blanket down to her eyes. Tang Yu only thought that it was a little funny. He kissed her. If you're tired in the afternoon, you don't have to go to the office. She shook her head. Her eyes were wide open. He finally kissed her eyelids. I'm leaving. His voice was a little hoarse. He knew that if he stayed any longer, he probably wouldn't be able to leave. When Tang Yu walked out of the door, he raised his hand to look at the time. It was already 9 o'clock. Usually, he would be in the office at this time. It was already 9:30 when he arrived at Shengyuan. He walked to his office with Xiao Ran following behind him. As they walked, he handed over the documents and explained them to him. Tang Yu walked to his desk and sat down. He threw his coat on the back of the chair and read the documents in his hands. His gaze landed on the last line and he frowned. Who suggested this? Xiao Ran's body bent a little. After seeing it, he said softly, it was Mr. Tang who suggested it. Tang Jiyuan? Although Tang Jiyuan had retired, he still retained 20% of Shengyuan's shares. Tang Yu had 40%, and Lin Yun had 10%. After Xiao Ran finished speaking, Tang Yu didn't say anything else. He glanced at the documents again, stood up, and walked towards the door. Xiao Ran immediately followed. In the conference room, Tang Jiyuan and Lin Yun were already there, along with a group of small shareholders. What attracted Tang Yu the most was Zhao Ku. Zhao Ku was sitting next to Tang Jiyuan. Tang Yu nodded at Lin Yun and sat down. This upset Tang Jiyuan. His son was treating him like nothing. Tang Jiyuan was angry and helpless, but Zhao Ku was even more upset. She had been married to Tang Yu for more than 10 years, and Tang Yu had never looked her in the eye. Originally, Tang Jiyuan didn't want to bring her here. It was Zhao Ku who insisted. She knew that old woman, Lin Yun, would come, and she had to watch over her. Of course, she knew that Tang Jiyuan couldn't forget his ex-wife. He would even call her Yun Yun in his dreams. Zhao Ku was disgusted. Chapter 92. After Tang Yu sat down, Xiao Ran distributed the documents and discussed the plan for the next half of the year. The minor shareholders were divided into several factions. Most of them supported Tang Yu, while some of them were Tang Jiyuan's old subordinates or Lin Yun's direct subordinates. When there were no objections, the atmosphere was good. However, once Lin Yun and Tang Jiyuan had different opinions, it became a little noisy. This was also a major feature of Shengyuan's shareholders' meeting, which had been maintained for more than 10 years. The meeting lasted for nearly 2 hours in the morning. During the lunch break, Tang Yu invited Lin Yun to a restaurant outside. Tang Jiyuan stared blankly for a long time before sighing softly and leaving with Zhao Ku unhappily. Tang Yu chose a very elegant Chinese restaurant. Lin Yun held a delicate cup in her hand and carefully tasted the tea. After a while, she put down the tea and looked at Tang Yu. Last time, your father called me and questioned me about that girl. Actually, she didn't take it to heart. She more or less knew about Tang Yu's problem. Moreover, that day at Jinrong's engagement ceremony, Tang Yu didn't formally introduce Pei Chichi to her. She thought it was nothing, but later on, Tang Yu's actions didn't express it in this way. Her son had never been a high-profile person. Even if he had a relationship with Shen Lian before, few people in the outside world knew about it. Tang Yu was holding the teapot to refill Lin Yun's water. When he heard this, his hand paused for a moment. After refilling the water, he put down the teapot in his hand and smiled faintly. Mom, I'll bring Chichi to see you another day. Lin Yun had a plan. Although it wasn't very convenient, she still coughed softly and asked suggestively, you guys are living together? This was what Tang Jiyuan told her as soon as he came today. She was a little surprised, so she had to ask. Just then, the waiter served the dishes. Tang Yu very calmly responded with a "hum" as he placed the dishes for Lin Yun. Lin Yun knew that Tang Yu and Pei Chichi had slept together. She breathed a sigh of relief and didn't ask anymore. It was rare for her to have a meal with her son, so it was quiet and warm. However, the afternoon meeting wasn't so warm. Tang Jiyuan saw that Tang Yu wanted to end the meeting, so he said directly, we haven't discussed my proposal to buy Pei's group yet. When he said this, he stared at Tang Yu's young face. Tang Yu had never given him any face in the company. Tang Jiyuan knew that Tang Yu hated him for abandoning Lin Yun, but at the time, he had no choice. If he didn't marry Zhao Ku would jump off a building. Tang Yu's gaze landed on Tang Jiyuan's face as he smiled lightly. I don't think a conservative company like Pei Corporation is worth acquiring by Sheng Yuan. You of Tang Yu of Jiyuan and Zhao Yang, Zhao Tang. I Pei's Group Yang, Pei's Group Jiyuan. Zhao Yang. She was the one who suggested buying Pei's group to Tang Jiyuan. If they destroyed the Pei family, Pei Chichi would never have the chance to enter the Tang family. Lin Yun's old man, Lin Yu, would never agree to it. Although Tang Yu was only taking care of Pei Chichi, she was worried. She couldn't let Pei Chichi have the chance to stand by her side. Chapter 93. Tang Jiyuan wanted to vomit blood. He naturally knew that Tang Yu had played a huge part in Pei Ming's revival. Moreover, Pei Ming had more or less received favors from Tang Yu later on. However, these were things that could not be said openly. Tang Jiyuan looked around and said slowly, since that's the case, we can only vote. Tang Yu didn't comment. Tang Jiyuan was the first to raise his hand. I approve of the acquisition of the Pei Corporation. Then, a few other shareholders followed suit. Zhao Ku heaved a sigh of relief, but then Lin Yun said indifferently, I don't approve. Tang Jiyuan looked over and Lin Yun repeated, I agree with Tang Yu. Yun, this isn't the time to be impulsive. Tang Jiyuan subconsciously called out her nickname. Lin Yun was a little annoyed, but Zhao Ku was embarrassed. Her beautiful face was a little pale, and she hurriedly called out to Jiyuan. Tang Jiyuan came back to his senses and looked a little uncomfortable. He coughed lightly and corrected himself. Director Lin, this concerns Sheng Yuan's future. Lin Yun sneered. I believe in Tang Yu's judgment. It wasn't easy for Tang Yu to sleep with a girl. How could he sleep with her now that the Pei Corporation was acquired? As a mother, she didn't care about anything else. All she cared about was that her son was happy. When Lin Yun was young, she also put her career first and neglected her family. It was only after she lost it that she realized that money wasn't that important. Tang Jiyuan was a little angry, but he understood what Lin Yun was thinking. But he didn't approve of this matter. It was fine if it was just for show, but if he really wanted to marry Pei Chichi, the Pei family's status was far from enough. Moreover, Pei Chichi was only an illegitimate daughter. On this matter, he and Zhao Ku were on the same side. Tang Jiyuan slowly swept his gaze across the crowd, wanting to get more support. Actually, everyone knew that there were only benefits to acquiring the Pei Corporation. There were no disadvantages. Perhaps because the benefits were too tempting, people raised their hands one after another. At this moment, the company's largest shareholder other than the Lin and Tang families, Zhao Yi, who was also the company's vice president, spoke up. I object to the acquisition. The Pei family is about to form an alliance with the Lin family's Rongguang, and our Sheng Yuan and Rongguang are still connected by the roots. Doing this will hurt our relationship with Rongguang. Tang Jiyuan was speechless. He had overlooked this point and couldn't help but look at Lin Yun. Lin Yun's face was expressionless, as if Zhao Yi's words didn't affect her at all. Zhao Yi's words also had weight in the company, so he got his support. In this way, Tang Jiyuan's proposal was somewhat insignificant. As a result, nothing was done. Tang Yu had a veto power, but he wouldn't use it easily. Otherwise, it would make him look arbitrary. As soon as Zhao Yi said this, Tang Yu took another look at him. Tang Yu remembered that Zhao Yi had proposed to acquire Pei Corporation in the previous meeting. At that time, Pei Ming's company was on its last breath. Zhao Yi's words made him look at him again. Tang Yu remembered that Zhao Yi had proposed to acquire the Pei Corporation in the previous meeting. At that time, Pei Ming's company was on its last breath. Zhao Yi also noticed Tang Yu's gaze. He smiled and didn't say anything. Most importantly, he was afraid that Lin Yun would misunderstand. His original intention was to get rid of Pei Ming, but he accidentally hurt his ex-wife's heart. Chapter 94. Tang Yu retracted his gaze and looked at Tang Jiyuan for a moment. He didn't look at Zhao Ku, just like before. Zhao Ku still wanted to say something, but Tang Jiyuan stopped her. Let's go. In the elevator, Zhao Ku's expression was a little ugly. She couldn't help but say to Tang Jiyuan, Jiyuan, are you going to watch Tang Yu be with that illegitimate daughter? Tang Jiyuan was also annoyed. He closed his eyes and ignored Zhao Ku's words. Jiyuan. Zhao Ku hugged his arm and said with a hint of dissatisfaction. Tang Jiyuan opened his eyes and looked at Zhao Ku. He said slowly, it's normal for men to play around. You don't have to be so nervous. Zhao Ku's voice was a little sharp. They're already living together. Tang Yu doesn't avoid the media. How could he be playing around? Tang Jiyuan looked at her deeply. His gaze was a little unreadable. Zhao Ku knew that she had said something wrong. She pursed her lips and said carefully, I'm doing it for his own good. Tang Yu has his own mother, Tang Jiyuan said calmly. Zhao Ku's eyes immediately turned red. She turned her face to the side. Tang Jiyuan, I know you can't forget Lin Yun. You couldn't help but call her Yun Yun just now. Why don't you just remarry her? I'll move out with Tang Xin. Tang Xin's health isn't good anyway. You won't like her. Tang Jiyuan's heart softened a little when she mentioned Tang Xin. Tang Xin was obedient and sensible, unlike Zhao Ku who was willful. Tang Jiyuan felt a little guilty towards his younger daughter. Tang Xin was born sick, probably to punish him for his philandering. It was a miracle that she was still alive. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Tang Jiyuan comforted her. He thought that Zhao Ku just wanted to build a good relationship with Tang Yu. One day, even if Tang Xin wasn't around, she would still have a place. But he never thought that he would never be able to guess Zhao Ku's thoughts. Only then did Zhao Ku feel a little happier. She tugged at Tang Jiyuan and said, I heard that the girl was transferred to the design department. Aren't you going to take a look? Tang Jiyuan thought for a moment. Over the years, Tang Yu had hardly been close to women. He really wanted to meet a girl who could make Tang Yu make an exception. When the retired emperor was patrolling, everyone was naturally respectful. Only then did Zhao Ku feel that she was being respected. Like the mistress of Sheng Yuan, she held Tang Jiyuan's arm and patrolled the floors. Pei Chichi arrived at the company before 3 o'clock. She wasn't busy in the design department, and no one asked her to do anything. She was completely free, but she also knew that this was an extremely rare opportunity, so she tried her best not to disturb others while observing the work of the big shots. When Tang Jiyuan and Zhao Ku entered, the first person they saw was Pei Chichi. Her beauty was the kind that could be seen at a glance in a crowd, just as eye-catching as Zhao Ku when she was young. Moreover, other than her beauty, Pei Chichi also had a charm that Zhao Ku didn't have. Tang Jiyuan had to admit that his heart, which had stopped beating for any beauty, really skipped a beat when he saw Pei Chichi. His eyes almost greedily stared at the side of Pei Chichi's face. She was really a beautiful girl. It wasn't surprising that Tang Yu was tempted. Even if he was 10 years younger, he would probably get her without any hesitation. Chapter 95. Your name is Pei Chichi, isn't it? Tang Jiyuan asked calmly. Pei Chichi looked up and saw Tang Jiyuan and Zhao Ku standing by the door. Her face turned pale. In Tang Jiyuan's eyes, this girl was just feeling guilty. She didn't know that it was because of Zhao Ku. Pei Chichi stared at Zhao Ku unconsciously. Zhao Ku was a little angry and her face was cold. After a long while, Tang Jiyuan coughed lightly. You're with Tang Yu, right? The moment she asked this question, everyone in the design department looked over. Although this was an open secret in Sheng Yuan, no one had said anything about it. This was because Pei Chichi was a low-profile person and had never put on airs as Tang Yu's woman. She didn't look like a mistress either. After all, which mistress would want to be an intern? As for Zhao Ku, everyone in Sheng Yuan didn't like her. She was a mistress and yet she was acting all high and mighty. Wasn't she shameless? Pei Chichi came back to her senses. She looked at Tang Jiyuan's face and found a touch of familiarity. Then she thought of Zhao Ku, who was next to her, and he should be Tang Yu's father. She nodded and didn't deny it. Tang Jiyuan sighed. She was such a beautiful girl and he didn't know what to do. At this moment, Zhao Ku raised her voice and said, Manager Chen. Manager Chen immediately went up to her. Mrs. Tang. Zhao Ku's face was stern. Since when did Sheng Yuan start using the back door? How can a student who hasn't even graduated work in the design department? Manager Chen was in a difficult position. This was the CEO's order, but Mrs. Tang was in such a state and he couldn't reject her. He muttered to himself. To Pei Chichi, this was an embarrassing situation. But the only thing she could feel was that Zhao Ku was making things difficult for her. This woman had abandoned her and now she couldn't tolerate her. This was her mother, but she hated her more than a stranger. Pei Chichi smiled lightly. Mrs. Tang, what qualifications do you think are needed to work in Sheng Yuan? Zhao Ku was taken aback by the question. Throughout her life, she had been around different men. She knew nothing about the workplace. Now that she was stumped, she couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed and angry. With a cold voice, he ordered, Manager Chen, fire Pei Chichi immediately. Manager Chen was put in a difficult position. How was he qualified? Just then, a deep voice came from the door. Who is Mrs. Tang to Sheng Yuan? What right do you have to fire my employee? Tang Yu came in, followed by Meng Qingcheng. Meng Qingcheng shrugged his shoulders and stood at the side to watch the show. Tang Yu against his little stepmother. Sigh, it seemed that they hadn't really clashed in the past decade or so. Was he going to start a war for Pei Chichi this time? Zhao Ku felt a stab in her heart, as if she had been stabbed by a needle. Tang Yu had never even called her auntie. Calling her Mrs. Tang was even more humiliating. Zhao Ku's lips trembled as she said, I'm married to your father. Tang Yu glanced at Tang Jiyuan and his eyes became even colder. That's between you and him. Mrs. Tang, you have nothing to do with Sheng Yuan. How did you get into the shareholders' meeting? He pointed the finger at Tang Jiyuan. Tang Jiyuan had wanted to say a few words for Zhao Ku so that Tang Yu would show some respect. But now that he was being scolded, he could only rub his nose and keep quiet. Chapter 96. Tang Yu pulled Pei Chichi over and placed her in front of him. I arranged for Pei Chichi to stay in the company. If Mrs. Tang wants to fire her, does that mean you have to fire me as well? Zhao Ku was stunned. Tang Yu's last sentence was very serious. She looked at him in a daze and subconsciously called out to Jiyuan. Tang Jiyuan sighed softly. Zhao Ku, let's go. Although he still held 20% of the shares, he didn't hold a position in Sheng Yuan, so he didn't have any personal power. Zhao Ku was too anxious today. Zhao Ku looked at Pei Chichi in Tang Yu's arms. Pei Chichi's eyes were cold and clear as she looked into them. Zhao Ku's heart trembled. She murmured silently, she's here to collect a debt, to collect a debt. Tang Jiyuan didn't hear her clearly, but Pei Chichi could tell from the shape of her lips that her little face was pale. In the end, Tang Jiyuan pulled Zhao Ku away. Zhao Ku was in a daze the whole time. She kept thinking that the child was here to collect a debt. Otherwise, why would she have a pair of eyes like that? When they got into the car, Tang Jiyuan turned to look at Zhao Ku and couldn't help but say, you're too impatient. Zhao Ku sobered up a little. She looked at Tang Jiyuan and said in a low voice, you also think that I shouldn't interfere with the company's affairs, right? Tang Jiyuan looked at her for a long time and reached out to hold her hand. He then said slowly, I know that you're not happy that I retired these few years. But Zhao Ku, Tang Yu is my only son. I've already let his mother down. I can't let him down anymore. I'm not a good father, but Sheng Yuan isn't decided by me alone. Zhao Ku suddenly pulled her hand back and smiled lightly. I know that you and Lin Yun fought for Sheng Yuan together. Of course, you won't hand it over to an outsider. She raised her head again and said unwillingly, Tang Jiyuan, all these years, you didn't let me have another child because you were afraid that it would threaten Tang Yu's position, right? Tang Jiyuan was speechless. He did not want to talk to her anymore. He did not want to have children because of Tang Xin. He hoped that Zhao Ku could spend more time with Tang Xin's health, but Zhao Ku didn't understand at all. Then, he thought of his ex-wife who didn't fight for anything. When he was with Lin Yun, it might be ordinary, but it was also comfortable. It wasn't that Tang Jiyuan hadn't regretted it all these years, but he had never shown it for Tang Xin's sake. Closing his eyes, Pei Chichi's little face appeared in his mind. In the past, Zhao Ku was also as fresh and picturesque as she was now. On the other side, Pei Chichi was still standing in the design department. Tang Yu looked down at her for a while and suddenly said, "Pei Chichi, come to my office." She raised her eyes and looked at him, not knowing what to do. Tang Yu had already walked to the door, but after a few steps, he suddenly turned back. The employees who were watching immediately lowered their heads and pretended to be very busy. "I'm not watching the boss's show. Why aren't you leaving?" His voice was a little deep and a little hoarse. Pei Chichi bit her lower lip and followed him. When she walked to his side, Tang Yu reached out and hugged her shoulder in front of everyone. Chapter 97. Towards Pei Chichi, at least, the CEO treasured her very much. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come here to save her and take her away. Pei Chichi looked up. Her entire body's senses were focused on his shoulder. His large palm was warm as he gently grasped her shoulder and brought her outside. Everyone in the design department saw the CEO pull Pei Chichi into his arms after they were out of the door. It was as if he was hugging his precious baby. How much love did he have to dote on her like this? Tang Yu lowered his head. His voice was a little faint, but it was also a little hoarse. Still unhappy. Pei Chichi's heart was a little wet. She turned her face away slightly. "No." The next second, she felt a kiss on her forehead. Tang Yu's voice rang out above her head. "I've already kissed you." With that said, he stroked her hair. Pei Chichi felt her heartbeat quicken. It was an indescribable feeling. She looked up, not realizing that she was still in his arms. After that, she was brought to his office. Tang Yu didn't say anything, nor did he explain his relationship with Zhao Ku. He just let her stay in his office. Occasionally, he would say a few words to her. Most of the time, he would ask her to help him pour a glass of water or carry some documents. Pei Chichi stayed up until 5 o'clock. Seeing that he still had no intention of getting off work, she walked over to his side. She tugged at his sleeve gently with her little hand. "What's wrong?" Tang Yu smiled at her actions in his heart, but he didn't show it on his face. This little fellow didn't even know how cute her actions were. Pei Chichi opened her mouth. Her voice was a little hoarse. "I want to go back first." If it were any other time, Tang Yu probably wouldn't agree to it. She could even eat and read here. But after what happened today, he thought that she probably needed some private space. And he wasn't the kind of man who would stare at his woman all the time. So he nodded. "Be careful when you go back." After thinking for a while, he added, "I'll be back at around 8. Make me some noodles." Pei Chichi nodded, picked up her bag, and walked towards the door. She no longer needed to wear her uniform, nor did she need to change on the way. She wore a refreshing dress and tied her hair in a ponytail, looking very girlish. When she reached the door, Tang Yu suddenly called out to her, "Chichi." Pei Chichi placed her finger on the doorknob and turned her head to look at him. Tang Yu adjusted his tie and left his seat to walk towards her. "Stand still." She looked at him, thinking that he wanted to kiss her. After all, he really liked kissing her these days. However, he just reached out to touch her little head and shook his head. "You're still too young." Pei Chichi instinctively lowered her head to look at her chest. "It's not small here, it's just right." His voice was a little hoarse, and she blushed. It was too hateful. Tang Yu smiled. "I'll get the chauffeur to send you." "Don't." She looked up at his smiling face and lowered her head in a fluster. Tang Yu's voice was deep. "Be obedient." Pei Chichi bit her lower lip. "I don't want to be obedient." "What are you talking about?" He pulled her little body that was about to leave and smiled ambiguously. Even though he was smiling, he still had the authority of a superior. Pei Chichi shrugged. "Nothing." Chapter 98. Meng Qingcheng was a little puzzled. "Didn't you drive here?" Also, she didn't have a schedule right now. Tang Yu looked at Pei Chichi and smiled. "I have a little friend who needs to go home first." "Little friend?" Meng Qingcheng felt like she was going to explode on the other end of the phone. Tang Yu doted on Pei Chichi like she was his daughter. Tang Yu put away his phone. Pei Chichi's fingers shrank, but he gripped it tightly and said calmly, "I'll walk you down." She didn't dare to retort because of what he said just now. She just looked at his slender and good-looking hand that was still holding hers. What's wrong? His smile was very warm as he led her outside. His hand had been holding hers all the way from the top floor to the first floor, and he didn't let go once. The lobby on the first floor was the most crowded when people got off work, but it was especially quiet today. Everyone was looking at the little girl in their CEO's hand. Pei Chichi felt uncomfortable. She struggled for a long time but couldn't break free. Her face was slightly red, and she looked down. Even her ears and the flesh on the back of her neck were slightly red. She looked very attractive. The car was already parked at the entrance. Tang Yu led her over. The chauffeur got out of the car and opened the car door for Pei Chichi. Before Pei Chichi got into the car, Tang Yu pulled her into his arms and kissed her. The employees of Sheng Yuan felt like they were going to explode again. What a good Ma Lisu plot. Pei Chichi now understood why he did that. She looked up and said in a soft voice, Tang Yu, you did it for no reason. I just wanted to kiss you. He smiled and reached out to touch her little head. Then, he walked her into the car and closed the door. The chauffeur nodded and walked to the front to start the car. Tang Yu watched the car leave before walking back to the Sheng Yuan building. From that day on, all the employees of Sheng Yuan knew that Pei Chichi was the CEO's girlfriend and that he liked her very much. Pei Chichi returned to her apartment in Xia City by car. While she was in the car, she saw Zhu Mailin pacing back and forth at the entrance. Let's stop here. Pei Chichi said softly, I want to take a walk. When the driver saw that they had arrived at the entrance of the neighborhood, he cooperated and stopped the car. Pei Chichi got out. After the car drove away, she turned to look at Zhu Mailin. Zhu Mailin walked over awkwardly and said in a strange voice, that car wasn't bad. Although the Pei family wasn't bad, they had never bought a car that cost tens of millions. Pei Chichi ignored her weird tone and asked directly, what's the matter? She doesn't even call me auntie anymore. She has become a rich wife after all. Zhu Mailin felt bad for Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi's eyes were a little cold. She carried her bag and walked into Xia City. However, Zhu Mailin couldn't let her in. The security guards of this neighborhood didn't know how to be flexible. They wouldn't let her in no matter what. So, she condescended to wait for Pei Chichi at the entrance. Now that she saw Pei Chichi enter, Zhu Mailin's mouth softened a little. Chichi, of course auntie is looking for you for something. She looked inside the neighborhood and said in an even more weird tone, it's rare for auntie to come. Let's talk inside. Pei Chichi stopped walking about 2 or 3 meters away from Zhu Mailin. Her expression was a little indifferent. If you have something to say it here. This isn't my house. If she could, Zhu Mailin would immediately tear Pei Chichi apart. Chapter 99. Pei Chichi didn't say anything, so Zhu Mailin simply said, Pei Huan is pregnant, so she must get married. Otherwise, she won't look good with a big belly. Jinrong family is a respectable family. Our Pei family can't be too shabby. You know your father's company. It's still half dead now. How can he have any spare money? So, auntie, are you going to sell me again? Pei Chichi interrupted Zhu Mailin's words. Her voice was a little cold. Zhu Mailin was a little annoyed for a moment, and her face darkened. Pei Chichi, are you just going to stand by and do nothing? Huan is your sister. She is also your daughter. Auntie, if you really care about her, find a way yourself. Pei Chichi was disgusted. Pei Huan was a human, but was she not a human? Zhu Mailin's face was stiff, and so was her voice. I just want you and Tang Yu to talk. 100 million is a drop in the bucket for him. Pei Chichi, you are so disappointing. Since you were young, you have been eating from me and using from me. Which thing is different from Pei Huan? The more Pei Chichi listened, the colder her heart became. She looked at Zhu Mailin's twisted face and sneered. The biggest difference between me and Pei Huan is that my mother is different. Zhu Mailin narrowed her eyes. Anger rushed to her brain, and she temporarily lost her mind. She raised her hand and wanted to slap her. Pei Chichi didn't have time to dodge, but Zhu Mailin's hand was caught by a big hand and thrown aside. Ju Mylin took a few steps back and almost fell. After she stood still, she found that it was Tang Yu. Tang Yu's car stopped beside them. Pei Chichi and Ju Mylin didn't notice when he got out of the car. At this time, Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed. She looked up at Tang Yu and couldn't say a word. Her origin, her family, her relationship with him, even if he was very good to her, it didn't change the fact that they were in a relationship of keeping. Tang Yu only glanced at her before looking at Ju Mylin. He was so noble that Ju Mylin didn't even dare to look up to him. You want another 100 million? Tang Yu's voice was even gentle. Ju Mylin looked at him and shrank back. She was afraid, but she could not overcome her greed. She steeled her heart and said, Mr. Tang, my Chichi is worth this much money. She's already mine. Tang Yu looked at the vulgar woman in front of him indifferently. Her face had already changed after being mean for a long time. Ju Mylin knew that she was in the wrong, so she whispered, come to think of it, I'm also Mr. Tang's mother-in-law. Pei Chichi was so angry that she was about to cry. What kind of mother-in-law was she? Ju Mylin had sold her out, and now she had the nerve to say this in front of her sugar daddy. Tang Yu smiled. I remember that you're not Pei Chichi's mother. And you sold her out. Ju Mylin felt a little guilty and didn't dare to say a word. Tang Yu looked at Pei Chichi and suddenly said, you go in first. She looked up at him in surprise. There was only one word in his eyes, be obedient. Pei Chichi hesitated for a moment, but finally walked into the neighborhood. Although Ju Mylin was unwilling, she didn't dare to say anything. After Pei Chichi walked away, Tang Yu's gaze fell on Ju Mylin's face again. Chapter 100. 100 million is fine, but I have a condition. Tang Yu's eyes were cold. Publish a newspaper and break off all relations with Pei Chichi. Ju Mylin took a deep breath and said in a sharp voice, that's absolutely impossible. If that was the case, then Pei Ming would definitely know that she had sold out Pei Chichi. Tang Yu's eyes were even colder. Then get out. Don't let me see you in front of Pei Chichi again. He had never said such vulgar words to an older woman, and Ju Mylin was the first one. He turned around, got into the car, and drove into the neighborhood. Ju Mylin stood there, gritting her teeth. Pei Chichi, this wretched girl, did she think that she couldn't do anything to her now that she had found someone to rely on? However, at the moment, she really couldn't do anything to Pei Chichi. Tang Yu returned to the apartment, threw his keys and briefcase on the porch, and walked in. He heard a slight sound coming from the kitchen, which should be Pei Chichi cooking. He walked into the kitchen quietly, and Pei Chichi stood in front of the kitchen counter, preparing ingredients with her back facing him. Her long hair was lifted, revealing a small part of her fair neck, and she was wearing a cartoon apron. She, however, unexpectedly tugged at his heartstrings. In Tang Yu's life plan, there were all kinds of ambitions, but there was no such thing as having a beautiful wife. But at this time, she appeared in his condominium and cooked for him so tenderly. His heart couldn't help but be slightly touched. He calmly walked over and wrapped his arms around her waist. His slightly hot lips gently bit the soft flesh behind her ear. His voice was also hot as he said, "Don't go if you don't want to." When he bit her, Pei Chichi's body trembled. She wanted to turn around, but he held her waist firmly. After a while, Pei Chichi bit her lip and said, "I'm afraid that Dad will be unhappy." Then, she continued to cut the vegetables, and the smell of the chicken soup in the pressure cooker was overflowing. Tang Yu sighed in his heart, and reached out to touch her earlobe. "Is Pei Ming good to you?" Pei Chichi didn't understand why he was concerned about this question, and she didn't know why he suddenly came back so early today. She didn't ask about the result of his conversation with Ju Mylin, because she knew that Tang Yu wasn't a man who would easily compromise. Tang Yu let go of her and smiled. "I'm going to take a shower first." She turned to look at him, and he just smiled without saying anything else. After he left, Pei Chichi was slightly startled. Then, she blushed and turned off the pressure cooker. She began to make chicken noodles seriously. She was silent that night, and she didn't feel happy until she lay on the bed. Tang Yu didn't force her, but he just lay next to her, holding her breasts with one hand and rubbing them slowly. Pei Chichi's breath was a little messy, but she didn't dare to let him move his hands away. She could only endure it. She felt uneasy, and after enduring it for almost 2 hours, Mr. Tang was also in a good mood. She felt a little sleepy. Tang Yu abruptly turned her around in his arms, and they lay face to face. Pei Chichi immediately sobered up. She raised her watery eyes and gazed at his handsome face. The light in the bedroom was dim, and it cast a heavy shadow on his face, so she couldn't see his expression clearly. Chapter 101. Pei Chichi was wearing white silk pajamas. The style was conservative, which was what he liked. She felt uneasy and climbed onto his shoulder carefully. She pressed her face against his neck, right at the spot where his pulse was. She could feel it, beating vigorously. "Do you want it now?" Her voice was soft and shallow, but it was clear in the quiet night. Naturally, it was also very touching. His big palm slid down her slender waist, and the other hand was placed on her back. He did not go any further, but just hugged her a little closer. Her face and her entire body were buried in his embrace. This moment, it was extremely thrilling. At least, for the first time, she felt that he treasured her so much. That feeling made her think that it was an illusion. Slowly, Tang Yu said, "Chichi, it's not your fault." She had been very careful with him, as a woman who had been bought for him. When he wanted her, she never said no. Even when she was tired and sleepy, she never rejected him. When he asked her to cook, she would cook. She was so obedient that he could not find any fault with her. But even so, Tang Yu was not satisfied. He felt that something was missing. He wanted more from her body. Pei Chichi looked up, a little at a loss. She did not want anyone to see her weakness, but Tang Yu always saw her in the most pathetic state. She asked again with a trembling voice, "Do you want it now?" Tang Yu suddenly grabbed her hand, turned around, and pinned her to his body. Her black hair was scattered on the side of the pillow, and it was also tangled around his arm. The silk pajamas had long fallen apart because of the tangled hair. Tang Yu's eyes were almost bloodshot. He stared at her eyes, not letting go of the slightest expression on her face. He asked her word by word, then, "Do you want me?" Pei Chichi's eyes narrowed. She did not expect him to ask such a question. She felt danger and wanted to turn her head, but he used one hand to hold her little chin, not giving her a chance to escape. Tang Yu had never been so domineering in front of her. Pei Chichi closed her eyes, her body trembling slightly. His eyes fixed on her, telling himself not to soften. Leaning against her neck, he narrowed his eyes and bit her artery. "Pei Chichi, tell me, do you want it?" They had been together for quite some time, and he knew her body very well. In the past, he couldn't bear to see her suffer, so when it came to such matters, it was fine as long as both parties were comfortable. He didn't act rashly, but tonight, it was as if he wanted to drive her crazy and make her lose control. In less than half an hour, she was crying and begging him for mercy, telling him that she wanted to. That night, he did not let her go, even when her voice was hoarse. Just before dawn, she lay limp in his arms. Tang Yu's fingers patted her back from time to time. He knew that he had gone too far. She was still young, only 20 years old. He should not have used such methods on such a young girl, but he couldn't control himself. Pei Chichi was exhausted. In her daze, she heard his gentle voice. "Chichi, come with me that day." She closed her eyes, and her little hands hugged his waist subconsciously. And at that moment, Tang Yu knew what he was not satisfied with and felt that it was not enough. It was Pei Chichi's heart. Chapter 102. Pei Chichi couldn't get up for the whole day the next day. Her back was sore. Before Tang Yu left, he told her that she had applied for leave from school and company. She didn't refuse because she was really tired. Chen Xinjie called halfway. Pei Chichi only said that she wasn't feeling well and didn't say anything else. Tang Yu was very busy that day. He had a business trip in the morning and didn't return to the office until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. When he returned to the top floor, he saw someone unexpected. Chen Xinjie. He remembered that she was Pei Chichi's classmate, but why was she here? Xiao Ran followed behind Tang Yu and also glanced at Chen Xinjie. She was a woman, so she naturally thought more. She had been in the workplace for a few years and didn't believe in so-called friendship. Often, best friends were the ones who stabbed you the most unexpectedly, but enemies were different. They were as honest to you as ever. Tang Yu's footsteps still stopped. Chen Xinjie was carrying a backpack and holding a few books in her hands. She bowed to Tang Yu and said, "I'm here to deliver today's handouts to Chichi and return the books I borrowed from her last time." She looked behind Tang Yu and seemed a little disappointed. "Chichi isn't here? She's at home," Tang Yu said naturally, which made Xiao Ran, who was at the side, surprised. He was surprised that they lived together, and even more surprised that Tang Yu said it so straightforwardly. Chen Xinjie was also stunned, then she showed a cute little girl's smile. "Then I'll go find her." Tang Yu walked to the office without thinking and said, "Just give it to me, I'll bring it to her." Chen Xinjie stood there and didn't know what to do. Xiao Ran said calmly, "Go in." Chen Xinjie looked around and walked in as if she was dreaming. Chen Xinjie had the same reaction as when Pei Chichi first came. Chen Xinjie carefully stepped on the pure white wool carpet and sat on the sofa uneasily. Xiao Ran asked the secretary to bring a glass of juice. Tang Yu went to deal with some things before he came over and sat opposite Chen Xinjie. "Where's the thing?" Chen Xinjie quickly took out the notes and placed them in front of Tang Yu. She looked at Tang Yu's handsome face and his slender fingers and blushed slightly. Tang Yu flipped through it. Chen Xinjie's handwriting was beautiful and delicate, and her handwriting was neat. "I made an extra copy for Chichi," Chen Xinjie added. Tang Yu closed it and said indifferently, "There's no need to go through so much trouble next time. Just make a copy." Chen Xinjie's face, which was originally smiling faintly, turned red. Tang Yu had already stood up. It was obvious that he wanted to see her out, but he took the notes with him. Chen Xinjie understood in her heart that the reason why he wanted to see her was because of Pei Chichi. She could walk into this building because of Pei Chichi's name. She grabbed her bag and said after a while, "Mr. Tang, I borrowed Chichi's books last time. I brought them with me. Please give them to her." She paused and said hesitantly, "These books are very important to her." Tang Yu turned around and took the books from her hand. They seemed to be borrowed from the library, and there was a square stamp on them. Chen Xinjie also knew that it was boring to stay, so she left quickly. Tang Yu put the books and the notes on the desk. He was going to work, but his eyes fell on the books. He suddenly wanted to know what books Pei Chichi usually read. Chapter 103. On the book's borrowing record, the last name recorded was Jin Rong. Tang Yu looked at it quietly for a long time before he picked up a few other books. They were all the same. Lin Jinrong's name was above Pei Chichi's. The two names stung his eyes when they were next to each other. Especially when she borrowed it. It was after he and Pei Chichi got together. Perhaps Pei Chichi didn't have any other thoughts, but there was a kind of liking that was called habit. Tang Yu put down the book and let out a long sigh. Suddenly, he didn't have the mood to work anymore. He read the two books until 6 in the evening. Xiao Ran came in with a stack of documents in her hands. She was surprised to see that the president's expression was a little serious and that he was smoking. There were a few books in front of him. They were definitely not Sheng Yuan's information. She put the documents on the table and said softly, "President, do you need to work overtime today? Do you need me to order food for you?" She saw that Tang Yu had no intention of leaving. Tang Yu looked up at Xiao Ran. He looked a little confused and a little bitter. At least in Xiao Ran's eyes, Tang Yu put out the cigarette in his hand. "No need, you can go home first." Xiao Ran wanted to say something but stopped. In the end, she didn't say anything and left. Her intuition told her that the president's depression had something to do with Pei Chichi. He carefully closed the door, and the spacious room became quiet again. Tang Yu's body sank deeply into the leather chair, and there was a slight sound of friction between his clothes and the chair. He closed his eyes and his slender fingers rhythmically tapped on the armrest beside him. His phone on the desk rang. He sat up slightly and reached out to take the phone. It was a call from Pei Chichi. Tang Yu stared at the phone screen for a few seconds and finally picked it up. However, his voice was a little hoarse. "Chichi." Pei Chichi's voice was a little soft, with her usual cleverness. "Are you coming back for dinner?" He didn't speak. The other side was silent for a while before a cautious voice said, "Do you need me to make chicken noodles for you?" Tang Yu was a little annoyed that she kept addressing him as you. He sat up straight and reached out to unbutton the collar of his shirt. After unbuttoning 2 buttons, he said in a cold voice, "Do you need to address me like that?" Pei Chichi stabbed him once and did not say anything else. Tang Yu couldn't bear it any longer. She closed her eyes, and the image of her and Jinrong's names together appeared in her mind. He really wanted to ask her if she still liked Jinrong, but his pride and his age did not allow him to ask. He didn't hang up the phone, and she didn't dare to either. The two of them were in a stalemate. Pei Chichi naturally felt his displeasure. As for why he was unhappy, she had no way of knowing. She only knew that tonight would probably not be a good night, unless he didn't come back. After a long time, Tang Yu finally said slowly, "Pei Chichi, I said that we'll get married if we have a child. Will you get pregnant just to marry me?" Pei Chichi was completely stunned. She remembered what he said last time, but she didn't take it seriously. If a man, especially a man who bought her, said something like that in bed, she would be doomed eternally if she took it seriously. But at this moment, he seemed to be asking for something from her very seriously. Pei Chichi didn't know what else he could ask of her other than her appearance. Chapter 104. She was afraid that if she answered, he would ask to have a child with her, and maybe he would impregnate her tonight. He had been taking precautions before. During the safe period, he naturally had no scruples, but during the dangerous period, no matter how passionate he was, he still remembered to use that at the last moment. She fell silent. Tang Yu listened to the light breathing on the other side, smiled faintly, and changed the topic. "I may not come back. You should go to bed early." He was kind to her, but this made him feel uncomfortable. Tang Yu hung up the phone. Of course, he was unhappy. Even if it was a little trick from a little girl like Chen Xinjie, he still couldn't help but care. Tang Yu sat until 8 o'clock. He walked to the French window and smoked a cigarette. His eyes were a little sore and dry. He took out his phone and dialed Meng Qingcheng's number. "Qingcheng, come out for a drink." Meng Qingcheng didn't quite believe his ears. Tang Yu, who had been very lonely at home recently, said that he wanted to come out for a drink. Most men who said that they wanted to drink at this time were planning to have a good time. Had Pei Xiaoqi fallen out of favor so quickly? An hour later, Tang Yu and Meng Qingcheng sat together in the private room of the fireworks club. The manager here had personally served them, and he had specially picked 2 very good-looking girls. Seeing that Tang Yu didn't refuse, Meng Qingcheng was even more certain that Pei Xiaoqi had probably annoyed Tang Yu. Holding a glass of wine in his hand, he slowly sipped it while looking at Tang Yu's expression. Pei Chichi is still young. She's a child, after all. Take your time to teach her. In terms of appearance, the 2 girls today were not bad, but compared to Pei Chichi, they were still a long way off. Tang Yu was used to eating big meals, so how could he eat such light dishes? Tang Yu took a sip of wine, playing with the exquisite crystal glass with his slender fingers, and looked at Meng Qingcheng. She's too sensible. Was he annoyed because he was too sensible? Meng Qingcheng smiled flirtatiously. Then you're in the wrong. Aren't women bought to be obedient and well-behaved? Wasn't he just looking for trouble by messing around with him all day long? Tang Yu collapsed on the leather sofa behind him. Under the refraction of the chandelier, his handsome face was mesmerizing. There was a slight blush on it, and it was exquisite to the extreme. Even though Meng Qingcheng was a man, he couldn't help but feel his heart skip a beat at this moment. If Sheng Yuan were to go bankrupt one day, Tang Yu would be able to thrive just by relying on his looks. "Qingcheng, what if I didn't treat her as a woman I bought?" Tang Yu propped his forehead with one hand and looked sideways at Meng Qingcheng. Meng Qingcheng almost spat out the mouthful of wine in his mouth. He knew that Tang Yu liked Pei Chichi very much and treated her like a little treasure, but what was the situation now? Tang Yu closed his eyes slightly, and his voice was actually a murmur with a hint of disappointment. "But she has someone she likes. Qingcheng, should I fulfill her wish?" She liked Jinrong so much, and that kind of love was wonderful. So wonderful that he felt that buying her was especially shameless. Meng Qingcheng was completely stunned. Tang Yu was troubled by love today, not because he was angry at Pei Chichi. In other words, Tang Yu's emotions counted as love. Meng Qingcheng's heart was a little confused. He didn't expect a person like Tang Yu to fall in love with a woman so easily. Chapter 105. She was just a young lady. Other than having physical contact with Tang Yu, she could also communicate telepathically. Yes, it must be chicken soup. Didn't Pei Chichi make chicken noodles for Tang Yu? Too much chicken soup. It seems that Pei Chichi's chicken soup is not bad, Meng Qingcheng concluded. Late at night, Meng Qingcheng left. Tang Yu lay on the sofa in the private room. His throat was a little dry, probably because he had too much to drink. An innocent girl was kneeling beside him. She was wearing a black dress, and her pair of fair legs looked very seductive as she knelt there. She unbuttoned his shirt with her small hands and looked up at Tang Yu's handsome face. Her face was a little red. Before Meng Qingcheng left, he told her to serve Mr. Tang well. She was trained in the club, and she was clean. She was used to receiving important clients. She had no experience, but she had taken such classes. So, she kissed Tang Yu's neck and slowly moved downwards. She did not dare to kiss his lips right away because the person who taught her said that some men did not like kissing. Unless they took the initiative, they should not move their lips easily. Half drunk, Tang Yu vaguely felt that someone was kissing him. Chichi, he groaned, and out of habit, his big hand grabbed her long hair. He forced her little face up and wanted to kiss her. Under the bright lights, he saw an unfamiliar face. Although she was beautiful, she was not Pei Chichi. Instantly, the excitement in his heart faded away. Yu Yu's hopes also cooled down. Tang Yu pulled the girl away and threw her aside. He got up and buttoned his shirt. The girl fell to the side with her skirt rolled up. She was kneeling on one knee. She looked very pitiful and very attractive. Seeing that Tang Yu was about to leave, she quickly got up and hugged him from behind. Her voice was gentle and cute. "Mr. Tang, did I do a bad job?" She stood on tiptoe and wanted to kiss the back of his neck, but Tang Yu pushed her away. "You did a good job. I'll ask someone to give you the check." The girl bit her lip and did not dare to do it again. It was just that she was unwilling. Tang Yu's condition was that even if she spent a month with him, she wouldn't have to sell herself here anymore. Tang Yu did not stay and directly walked out. In the elevator, he looked at his slightly messy appearance and touched his forehead. He did not seem to reject women as much anymore. If he wanted to, he could have this girl. But, not her, he did not want it. Physically, he could accept it, but mentally, he did not want it. He suddenly chuckled softly. In addition to helplessness, there was also a hint of recognition. When he got into the car, he was completely sober. He made a call to Meng Qingcheng. "Set off immediately for that project in Africa. Don't come back for a month." On the other side, Meng Qingcheng was flirting with the pretty girl. Although he was just angry, this was Tang Yu's revenge, because he gave him a woman. If he did not want her, then he did not want her. Instead, he acted like an innocent young man and kept his virginity for Pei Chichi. Tang Yu hung up the phone and smoked another cigarette. Then, he started the car and drove back to Shia City. When he got home, the lights were turned off. It was dark everywhere. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.